Mcteague's Story of San Francisco Part 2 by Frank Norris. Chapter 18. That same night, Mcteague was awakened by a shrill scream and woke to find Trina's arms around his neck. She was trembling so that the bed springs creaked. "Huh!" cried the dentist, sitting up in bed, raising his clenched fists. "Huh! What? What is it? What is it?" "Oh, Mac," gasped his wife, "I had such an awful dream. I dreamed about Maria. I thought she was chasing me, and I couldn't run, and her throat was, she was all covered with blood. Oh, I am so frightened." Trina had borne up very well for the first day or so after the affair, and had given her testimony to the coroner with far greater calmness than Heiss. It was only a week later that the horror of the thing came upon her again. She was so nervous that she hardly dared to be alone in the daytime, and almost every night woke with a cry of terror, trembling with the recollection of some dreadful nightmare. The dentist was irritated beyond all expression by her nervousness, and especially was he exasperated when her cries woke him suddenly in the middle of the night. He would sit up in bed, rolling his eyes wildly, throwing out his huge fists at what he did not know, exclaiming, "What bewildered and hopelessly confused!" Then when he realized that it was only Trina, his anger kindled abruptly. "Oh, you and your dreams! You go to sleep, or I'll give you a dressing down." Sometimes he would hit her a great thwack with his open palm, or catch her hand and bite the tips of her fingers. Trina would lie awake for hours afterward, crying softly to herself. Then, by and by, "Mac," she would say timidly. "Huh! Mac, do you love me? Huh! What? Go to sleep." "Don't you love me any more, Mac?" "Oh, go to sleep. Don't bother me." "Well, do you love me, Mac?" "I guess so." "Oh, Mac, I'm only you now, and if you don't love me, what is going to become of me? Shut up and let me go to sleep. Well, just tell me that you love me." The dentist would turn abruptly away from her, burying his big blonde head in the pillow and covering up his ears with the blankets. Then Trina would sob herself to sleep. The dentist had long since given up looking for a job. Between breakfast and supper time, Trina saw but little of him. Once the morning meal over, Mcteague bestirred himself, put on his cap. He had given up wearing even a hat since his wife had made him sell his silk hat, and went out. He had fallen into the habit of taking long and solitary walks beyond the suburbs of the city. Sometimes it was to the Cliff House, occasionally to the park, where he would sit on the sun-warmed benches, smoking his pipe and reading ragged ends of old newspapers. But more often it was to the Presidio reservation. Mcteague would walk out to the end of the Union Street car line, entering the reservation at the terminus. Then he would work down to the shore of the bay, follow the shoreline to the old fort at the Golden Gate, and, turning the point here, come out suddenly upon the full sweep of the Pacific. Then he would follow the beach down to a certain point of rocks that he knew. Here he would turn inland, climbing the bluffs to a rolling grassy down sown with blue iris and a yellow flower that he did not know the name of. On the far side of this, down was a broad, well-kept road. Mcteague would keep to this road until he reached the city again by the way of the Sacramento streetcar line. The dentist loved these walks. He liked to be alone. He liked the solitude of the tremendous tumbling ocean, the fresh, windy downs. He liked to feel the gusty trades flogging his face, and he would remain for hours, watching the roll and plunge of the breakers with the silent, unreasoned enjoyment of a child. All at once he developed a passion for fishing. He would sit all day nearly motionless upon a point of rocks, his fish line between his fingers, happy if he caught 3 perch in 12 hours. At noon he would retire to a bit of level turf around an angle of the shore and cook his fish, eating them without salt or knife or fork. He thrust a pointed stick down the mouth of the perch and turned it slowly over the blaze. When the grease stopped dripping, he knew that it was done, and would devour it slowly and with tremendous relish, picking the bones clean, eating even the head. he remembered. How often he used to do this sort of thing when he was a boy in the mountains of Placer County before he became a carboy at the mine. The dentist enjoyed himself hugely during these days. The instincts of the old-time miner were returning. In the stress of his misfortune, Mcteague was lapsing back to his early estate. One evening, as he reached home after such a tramp, he was surprised to find Trina standing in front of what had been Zerko's house, looking at it thoughtfully, her finger on her lips. "What you doing here?" growled the dentist as he came up. There was a rooms to let sign on the street door of the house. "Now we've found a place to move to," exclaimed Trina. "What?" cried Mcteague. "There, in that dirty house where you found Maria?" "I can't afford that room in the flat anymore, now that you can't get any work to do. But there's where Zerko killed Maria, the very house, and you wake up and squeal in the night just thinking of it. I know it will be bad at first, but I'll get used to it, and it's just half again as cheap as where we are now. I was looking at a room. We can have it dirt cheap. It's a back room over the kitchen. A German family are going to take the front part of the house and sublet the rest. I'm going to take it. It'll be money in my pocket." "But it won't be any in mine," vociferated the dentist angrily. "I'll have to live in that dirty rat hole just so's you can save money. I ain't any the better off for it." "Find work to do, and then we'll talk," declared Trina. "I am going to save up some money against a rainy day. And if I can save more by living here, I'm going to do it, even if it is the house Maria was killed in. I don't care." "All right," said Mcteague, and did not make any further protest. His wife looked at him surprised. She could not understand this sudden acquiescence. Perhaps Mcteague was so much away from home of late that he had ceased to care where or how he lived. But this sudden change troubled her a little for all that. The next day the Mcteagues moved for a second time. It did not take them long. They were obliged to buy the bed from the landlady, a circumstance which nearly broke Trina's heart. And this bed, a couple of chairs, Trina's trunk, an ornament or two, the oil stove, and some plates and kitchenware were all that they could call their own now, and this back room in that wretched house with its grisly memories, the one window looking out into a grimy maze of backyards and broken sheds, was what they now knew as their home. The Mcteagues now began to sink rapidly lower and lower. They became accustomed to their surroundings. Worst of all, Trina lost her pretty ways and her good looks. The combined effects of hard work, avarice, poor food, and her husband's brutalities told on her swiftly. Her charming little figure grew coarse, stunted, and dumpy. She who had once been of a cat-like neatness, now slovened all day about the room in a dirty flannel wrapper, her slippers clapping after her as she walked. At last she even neglected her hair. The wonderful swarthy tiara, the coiffure of a queen, that shaded her little pale forehead. In the morning she braided it before it was half combed, and piled and coiled it about her head in haphazard fashion. It came down half a dozen times a day. By evening it was an unkempt, tangled mass, a veritable rat's nest. Ah, no, it was not very gay, that life of hers, when one had to rustle for two, cook and work and wash, to say nothing of paying the rent. What odds was it if she was slatternly, dirty, coarse? Was there time to make herself look otherwise? And who was there to be pleased when she was all prinked out? Surely not a great brute of a husband who bit you like a dog, and kicked and pounded you as though you were made of iron. Ah, no, better let things go, and take it as easy as you could. Hump your back, and it was soonest over. The one room grew abominably dirty, reeking with the odors of cooking and of non-poisonous paint. The bed was not made until late in the afternoon, sometimes not at all. Dirty, unwashed crockery, greasy knives, sodden fragments of yesterday's meals cluttered the table, while in one corner was the heap of evil-smelling, dirty linen. Cockroaches appeared in the crevices of the woodwork, the wallpaper bulged from the damp walls and began to peel. Trina had long ago ceased to dust or to wipe the furniture with a bit of rag. The grime grew thick. Upon the window pans and in the corners of the room, all the filth of the alley invaded their quarters like a rising muddy tide. Between the windows, however, the faded photograph of the couple in their wedding finery looked down upon the wretchedness, Trina still holding her set bouquet straight before her, Mcteague standing at her side, his left foot forward in the attitude of a Secretary of State, while nearby hung the canary, the one thing the dentist clung to obstinately, piping and chittering all day in its little gilt prison. And the tooth, the gigantic golden molar of French gilt, enormous and ungainly, sprawled its branching prongs in one corner of the room by the footboard of the bed. The Mcteagues had come to use it as a sort of substitute for a table. After breakfast and supper, Trina piled the plates and greasy dishes upon it to have them out of the way. One afternoon, the other dentist, Mcteague's old-time rival, the wearer of marvelous waistcoats, was surprised out of all countenance to receive a visit from Mcteague. The other dentist was in his operating room at the time and work upon a plaster of Paris mold. To his call of, "Come right in. Don't you see the sign? Enter without knocking?" Mcteague came in. He noted at once how airy and cheerful was the room. A little fire coughed and tittered on the hearth. A brindled greyhound sat on his haunches watching it intently. A great mirror over the mantel offered to view an array of actresses' pictures thrust between the glass and the frame, and a big bunch of freshly cut violets stood in a glass bowl on the polished cherry-wood table. The other dentist came forward briskly, exclaiming cheerfully, "Oh, Mr. Mcteague, how do, how do, how do?" The fellow was actually wearing a velvet smoking jacket, a cigarette was between his lips. His patent leather boots reflected the firelight. Mcteague wore a black surah negligee shirt without a cravat. Huge buckled brogans, hobnailed, gross, encased his feet. The hems of his trousers were spotted with mud. His coat was frayed at the sleeves and a button was gone. In 3 days he had not shaved. His shock of heavy blonde hair escaped from beneath the visor of his woolen cap and hung low over his forehead. He stood with awkward, shifting feet and uncertain eyes before the dapper young fellow who reeked of the barber shop and whom he had once ordered from his rooms. "What can I do for you this morning, Mr. Mcteague? Something wrong with the teeth, eh?" "No, no." Mcteague, floundering in the difficulties of his speech, forgot the carefully rehearsed words with which he had intended to begin this interview. "I want to sell you my sign," he said stupidly. "That big tooth of French." "Guilt, you know that you made an offer for once." "Oh, I don't want that now," said the other loftily. "I prefer a little quiet signboard. Nothing pretentious, just the name, and dentist after it. These big signs are vulgar. No, I don't want it." Mcteague remained, looking about on the floor, horribly embarrassed, not knowing whether to go or to stay. "But I don't know," said the other dentist reflectively, "if it will help you out any. I guess you're pretty hard up. Oh, well, I tell you what, I'll give you $5 for it." All right, all right. On the following Thursday morning, Mcteague woke to hear the eaves dripping and the prolonged rattle of the rain upon the roof. "Raining," he growled in deep disgust, sitting up in bed and winking at the blurred window. "It's been raining all night," said Trina. She was already up and dressed and was cooking breakfast on the oil stove. Mcteague dressed himself, grumbling, "Well, I'll go, anyhow. The fish will bite all the better for the rain." "Look here, Mac," said Trina, slicing a bit of bacon as thinly as she could. "Look here, why don't you bring some of your fish home sometime?" "Huh!" snorted the dentist. "So's we could have 'em for breakfast. Might save you a nickel, mightn't it?" "Well, and if it did, or you might fish for the market, the fisherman across the street would buy 'em of you." "Shut up!" exclaimed the dentist, and Trina obediently subsided. "Look here," continued her husband, fumbling in his trousers pocket and bringing out $1. I'm sick and tired of coffee and bacon and mashed potatoes. Go over to the market and get some kind of meat for breakfast. Get a steak or chops or something. Why, Mac, that's a whole $1, and he only gave you 5 for your sign. We can't afford it. Sure, Mac, let me put that money away against a rainy day. You're just as well off without meat for breakfast. You do as I tell you. Get some steak or chops or something. Please, Mac, dear. Go on now. I'll bite your fingers again pretty soon. But the dentist took a step towards her, snatching at her hand. All right, I'll go, cried Trina, wincing and shrinking. I'll go. She did not get the chops at the big market, however. Instead, she hurried to a cheaper butcher shop on a side street 2 blocks away and bought 15 cents worth of chops from a side of mutton some 2 or 3 days old. She was gone some little time. Give me the change, exclaimed the dentist as soon as she returned. Trina handed him a quarter, and when Mcteague was about to protest, broke in upon him with a rapid stream of talk that confused him upon the instant. But for that matter, it was never difficult for Trina to deceive the dentist. He never went to the bottom of things. He would have believed her if she had told him the chops had cost $1. There's 60 cents saved anyhow, thought Trina, as she clutched the money in her pocket to keep it from rattling. Trina cooked the chops, and they breakfasted in silence. Now, said Mcteague as he rose, wiping the coffee from his thick mustache with the hollow of his palm, now I'm going fishing, rain or no rain. I'm going to be gone all day. He stood for a moment at the door, his fish line in his hand, swinging the heavy sinker back and forth. He looked at Trina as she cleared away the breakfast things. So long, said he, nodding his huge square-cut head. This amiability in the matter of leave-taking was unusual. Trina put the dishes down and came up to him, her little chin, once so adorable, in the air. Kiss me good-bye, Mac, she said, putting her arms around his neck. You do love me a little yet, don't you, Mac? We'll be happy again some day. This is hard times now, but we'll pull out. You'll find something to do pretty soon. I guess so, growled Mcteague, allowing her to kiss him. The canary was stirring nimbly in its cage, and just now broke out into a shrill trilling, its little throat bulging and quivering. The dentist stared at it. Say, he remarked slowly, I think I'll take that bird of mine along. Sell it? Inquired Trina. Yes, sell it, inquired Trina. Yes, sell it. Well, you are coming to your senses at last, answered Trina, approvingly. But don't you let the bird store man cheat you. That's a good songster. And with the cage, you ought to make him give you $5. You stick out for that at. First, anyhow. Mcteague unhooked the cage and carefully wrapped it in an old newspaper, remarking he might get cold. Well, so long, he repeated, so long. Goodbye, Mac. When he was gone, Trina took the 60 cents she had stolen from him out of her pocket and recounted it. It's 60 cents, all right, she said proudly. But I do believe that dime is too smooth. She looked at it critically. The clock on the powerhouse of the Sutter Street cable struck 8. 8 o'clock already, she exclaimed. I must get to work. She cleared the breakfast things from the table, and drawing up her chair and her workbox, began painting the sets of Noah's Ark animals she had whittled the day before. She worked steadily all the morning. At noon she lunched, warming over the coffee left from breakfast and frying a couple of sausages. By 1 she was bending over her table again. Her fingers, some of them lacerated by Mcteague's teeth, flew, and the little pile of cheap toys in the basket at her elbow grew steadily. Where do all the toys go to? She murmured. The thousands and thousands of these Noah's Arks that I have made horses and chickens and elephants, and always there never seems to be enough. It's a good thing for me that children break their things, and that they all have to have birthdays and Christmases. She dipped her brush into a pot of Van Dyke brown and painted one of the whittled toy horses in 2 strokes. Then a touch of ivory black with a small flat brush created the tail and mane. and dots of Chinese white made the eyes. The turpentine in the paint dried it almost immediately, and she tossed the completed little horse into the basket. At 6 o'clock, the dentist had not returned. Trina waited until 7 and then put her work away and ate her supper alone. "I wonder what's keeping Mac," she exclaimed, as the clock from the powerhouse on Sutter Street struck 7:30. "I know he's drinking somewhere," she cried, apprehensively. He had the money from his sign with him. At 8 o'clock she threw a shawl over her head and went over to the harness shop. If anybody would know where Mcteague was, it would be Heise, but the harness maker had seen nothing of him since the day before. "He was in here yesterday afternoon, and we had a drink or two at Frenna's. Maybe he's been in there today." "Oh, won't you go in and see?" said Trina. "Mac always came home to his supper. He never likes to miss his meals, and I'm getting frightened about him." Heise went into the bar room next door and returned with no definite news. Frenna had not seen the dentist since he had come in with the harness maker the previous afternoon. Trina even humbled herself to ask of the Ryers with whom they had quarreled if they knew anything of the dentist's whereabouts, but received a contemptuous negative. "Maybe he's come in while I've been out," said Trina to herself. She went down Polk Street again, going towards the flat. The rain had stopped, but the sidewalks were still glistening. The cable cars trundled by, loaded with theater-goers. The barbers were just closing their shops. The candy store in the corner was brilliantly lighted and was filling up, while the green and yellow lamps from the drugstore directly opposite threw kaleidoscopic reflections deep down into the shining surface of the asphalt. A band of Salvationists began to play and pray in front of Frenna's saloon. Trina hurried on down the gay street, with its evening's brilliancy and small activities, her shawl over her head, one hand lifting her faded skirt from off the wet pavements. She turned into the alley, entered Zerkov's old home by the ever-open door, and ran upstairs to the room. Nobody. "Why, isn't this fun 9?" she exclaimed, half aloud, standing on the threshold, her little milk-white forehead curdling to a frown, one sore finger on her lips. Then a great fear seized upon her. Inevitably, she associated the house with a scene of violent death. "No, no," she said to the darkness. "Mac is all right. A.G. can take care of himself." But for all that she had a clear-cut vision of her husband's body, bloated with seawater, his blonde hair streaming like kelp, rolling inertly in shifting waters. "He couldn't have fallen off the rocks," she declared firmly. "There he is now." She heaved a great sigh of relief as a heavy tread sounded in the hallway below. She ran to the banisters, looking over and calling, "Oh, Mac, is that you?" Mac? It was the German whose family occupied the lower floor. The powerhouse clock struck 9. "My God, where is Mac?" cried Trina, stamping her foot. She put the shawl over her head again and went out and stood on the corner of the alley and Polk Street, watching and waiting, craning her neck to see down the street. Once, even, she went out upon the sidewalk in front of the flat and sat down for a moment upon the horse block there. She could not help remembering the day when she had been driven up to that horse block in a hack. Her mother and father and August and the twins were with her. It was her wedding day. Her wedding dress was in a huge tin trunk on the driver's seat. She had never been happier before in all her life. She remembered how she got out of the hack and stood for a moment upon the horse block looking up at Mcteague's windows. She had caught a glimpse of him at his shaving, the lather still on his cheek, and they had waved their hands at each other. Instinctively, Trina looked up at the flat behind her, looked up at the bay window where her husband's dental parlors had been. It was all dark. The windows had the blind, sightless appearance imparted by vacant, untenanted rooms. A rusty iron rod projected mournfully from one of the window ledges. "There's where our sign hung once," said Trina. She turned her head and looked down Polk Street towards where the other dentist had his rooms, and there, overhanging the street from his window, newly furbished and brightened, hung the huge tooth, her birthday present to her husband, flashing and glowing in the white glare of the electric lights like a beacon of defiance and triumph. "Ah, no," whispered Trina, choking back a sob. "Life isn't so gay. But I wouldn't mind. No, I wouldn't mind anything if only Mac was home all right." She got up from the horse block and stood again on the corner of the alley, watching and listening. It grew later. The hours passed. Trina kept at her post. The noise of approaching footfalls grew less and less frequent. Little by little, Polk Street dropped back into solitude. 11 o'clock struck from the powerhouse clock. Lights were extinguished. At 1 o'clock, the cable stopped, leaving an abrupt and numbing silence in the air. All at once it seemed very still. The only noises were the occasional footfalls of a policeman and the persistent calling of ducks and geese in the closed market across the way. The street was asleep. When it is night and dark and one is awake and alone, one's thoughts take the color of the surroundings, become gloomy, somber, and very dismal. All at once an idea came to Trina, a dark, terrible idea. Worse even than the idea of Mcteague's death. "Oh no," she cried. "Oh no, it isn't true. But suppose. She left her post and hurried back to the house. No, she was saying under her breath. It isn't possible. Maybe he's even come home already by another way. But suppose. She ran up the stairs, opened the door of the room, and paused, out of breath. The room was dark and empty. With cold, trembling fingers, she lighted the lamp and, turning about, looked at her trunk. The lock was burst. No, cried Trina. It's not true. She dropped on her knees before the trunk, and tossed back the lid, and plunged her hands down into the corner underneath her wedding dress, where she always kept the savings. The brass match safe and the chamois skin bag were there. They were empty. Trina flung herself full length upon the floor, burying her face in her arms, rolling her head from side to side. Her voice rose to a wail. No, it's not true. Oh, he couldn't have done it. Oh, how could he have done it? All my money, all my little savings, and deserted me. He's gone, my money's gone, my dear money. My dear money, my dear gold pieces that I've worked so hard for. Oh, to have deserted me, gone for good, gone and never coming back, gone with my gold pieces, gone. I'll never see them again, and I've worked so hard, so hard for him, for them. No, it's not true. It is true. What will become of me now? Oh, if you'll only come back, you can have all the money, half of it. Oh, give me back my money. Give me back my money, and I'll forgive you. You can leave me then if you want to. Oh, my money. Mac, you gone for good. You don't love me any more, and now I'm a beggar. My money's gone. My husband's gone. Her grief was terrible. She dug her nails into her scalp, and clutching the heavy coils of her thick black hair, tore it again and again. She struck her forehead with her clenched fists. Her little body shook from head to foot with the violence of her sobbing. She ground her small teeth together and beat her head upon the floor with all her strength. Her hair was uncoiled and hanging a tangled, disheveled mass far below her waist. Her dress was torn. A spot of blood was upon her forehead. Her eyes were swollen. Her cheeks flamed vermilion from the fever that raged in her veins. Old Miss Baker found her thus towards 5 o'clock the next morning. What had happened between 1 o'clock and dawn of that fearful night, Trina never remembered. She could only recall herself, as in a picture, kneeling before her broken and rifled trunk. And then weeks later, so it seemed to her, she woke to find herself in her own bed with an iced bandage about her forehead and the little old dressmaker at her side, stroking her hot, dry palm. The facts of the matter were that the German woman who lived below had been awakened some hours after midnight by the sounds of Trina's weeping. She had come upstairs and into the room to find Trina stretched face downward upon the floor, half conscious and sobbing, in the throes of an hysteria for which there was no relief. The woman, terrified, had called her husband, and between them they had got Trina upon the bed. Then the German woman happened to remember that Trina had friends in the big flat nearby, and had sent her husband to fetch the retired dressmaker, while she herself remained behind to undress Trina and put her to bed. Miss Baker had come over at once and began to cry herself at the sight of the dentist's poor little wife. She did not stop to ask what the trouble was, and indeed it would have been useless to attempt to get any coherent explanation from Trina at that time. Miss Baker had sent the German woman's husband to get some ice at one of the all-night restaurants of the street, had kept cold, wet towels on Trina's head, had combed and recombed her wonderful thick hair, and had sat down by the side of the bed holding her hot hand with its poor maimed fingers, waiting patiently until Trina should be able to speak. Towards morning, Trina awoke, or perhaps it was a mere regaining of consciousness, looked a moment at Miss Baker, then about the room until her eyes fell upon her trunk with its broken lock. Then she turned over upon the pillow and began to sob again. She refused to answer any of the little dressmaker's questions, shaking her head violently, her face hidden in the pillow. By breakfast time her fever had increased to such a point that Miss Baker took matters into her own hands and had the German woman call a doctor. He arrived some 20 minutes later. He was a big, kindly fellow who lived over the drugstore on the corner. He had a deep voice and a tremendous striding gait, less suggestive of a physician than of a sergeant of a cavalry troop. By the time of his arrival, little Miss Baker had divined intuitively the entire trouble. She heard the doctor's swinging tramp in the entry below and heard the Forval German woman saying, "Ride up der stairs at der back of der Halle, der Room mit der Door open." Miss Baker met the doctor at the landing. She told him in a whisper of the trouble. "Her husband's deserted her, I'm afraid, doctor, and took all of her money, a good deal of it. It's about killed the poor child. She was out of her head a good deal of the night, and now she's got a raging fever." The doctor and Miss Baker returned to the room and entered, closing the door. The big doctor stood for a moment looking down at Trina, rolling her head from side to side upon the pillow, her face scarlet, her enormous mane of hair spread out on either side of her. The little dressmaker remained at his elbow, looking from him to Trina. "Poor little woman," said the doctor. "Poor little woman." Miss Baker pointed to the trunk, whispering, "See, there's where she kept her savings. See, he broke the lock." "Well, Mrs. Mcteague," said the doctor, sitting down by the bed and taking Trina's wrist, "a little fever, eh?" Trina opened her eyes and looked at him, and then at Miss Baker. She did not seem in the least surprised at the unfamiliar faces. She appeared to consider it all as a matter of course. "Yes," she said with a long, tremulous breath, "I have a fever, and my head I aches and aches and aches." The doctor prescribed rest and mild opiates. Then his eye fell upon the fingers of Trina's right hand. He looked at them sharply. A deep red glow, unmistakable to a physician's eyes, was upon some of them, extending from the fingertips up to the second knuckle. "Hello!" he exclaimed. "What's the matter here?" In fact, something was very wrong indeed. For days Trina had noticed it. The fingers of her right hand had swollen as never before, aching and discolored. Cruelly lacerated by Mcteague's brutality as they were, she had nevertheless gone on about her work on the Noah's Ark animals, constantly in contact with the non-poisonous paint. She told as much to the doctor in answer to his questions. He shook his head with an exclamation. "Why, this is blood poisoning, you know," he told her. "The worst kind. You'll have to have those fingers amputated, beyond a doubt, or lose the entire hand, or even worse." And my work, exclaimed Trina. Chapter 19. One can hold a scrubbing brush with 2 good fingers and the stumps of 2 others, even if both joints of the thumb are gone, but it takes considerable practice to get used to it. Trina became a scrub woman. She had taken counsel of Selina, and through her had obtained the position of caretaker in a little memorial kindergarten over on Pacific Street. Like Polk Street, it was an accommodation street, but running through a much poorer and more sordid quarter. Trina had a little room over the kindergarten schoolroom. It was not an unpleasant room. It looked out upon a sunny little court floored with boards and used as the children's playground. 2 great cherry trees grew here, the leaves almost brushing against the window of Trina's room and filtering the sunlight so that it fell in round golden spots upon the floor of the room. Like gold pieces, Trina said to herself. Trina's work consisted in taking care of the kindergarten rooms, scrubbing floors, washing the windows, dusting and airing, and carrying out the ashes. Besides this, she earned some $5 a month by washing down the front steps of some big flats on Washington Street and by cleaning out vacant houses after the tenants had left. She saw no one. Nobody knew her. She went about her work from dawn to dark, and often entire days passed when she did not hear the sound of her own voice. She was alone, a solitary, abandoned woman, lost in the lowest eddies of the great city's tide. The tide that always ebbs. When Trina had been discharged from the hospital after the operation on her fingers, she found herself alone in the world, alone with her $5,000. The interest of this would support her and yet allow her to save a little. But for a time, Trina had thought of giving up the fight altogether and of joining her family in the southern part of the state. But even while she hesitated about this, she received a long letter from her mother, an answer to one she herself had written just before the amputation of her right-hand fingers, the last letter she would ever be able to write. Mrs. Siep's letter was one long lamentation. She had her own misfortunes to bewail as well as those of her daughter. The carpet cleaning and upholstery business had failed. Mr. Sieppe and August had left for New Zealand with a colonization company, whither Mrs. Sieppe and the twins were to follow them as soon as the colony established itself. So far from helping Trina in her ill fortune, it was she, her mother, who might some day in the near future be obliged to turn to Trina for aid. So Trina had given up the idea of any help from her family. For that matter, she needed none. She still had her $5,000, and Uncle Obermann paid her the interest with a machine-like regularity. Now that Mcteague had left her, there was one less mouth to feed. And with this saving, together with the little she could earn as scrubwoman, Trina could almost manage to make good the amount she lost by being obliged to cease work upon the Noah's Ark animals. Little by little, her sorrow over the loss of her precious savings overcame the grief of Mcteague's desertion of her. Her avarice had grown to be her one dominant passion. Her love of money for the money's sake brooded in her heart, driving out by degrees every other natural affection. She grew thin and meeker. Her flesh clove tight to her small skeleton. Her small, pale mouth and little uplifted chin grew to have a certain feline eagerness of expression. Her long, narrow eyes glistened continually, as if they caught and held the glint of metal. One day, as she sat in her room, the empty brass matchbox and the limp chamois bag in her hands, she suddenly exclaimed, "I could have forgiven him if he had only gone away and left me my money. I could have forgiven him even this." She looked at the stumps of her fingers. But now, her teeth closed tight and her eyes flashed. Now I'll never forgive him as long as I live. The empty bag and the hollow light matchbox troubled her. Day after day she took them from her trunk and wept over them, as other women weep over a dead baby's shoe. Her $400 were gone, were gone, were gone. She would never see them again. She could plainly see her husband spending her savings by handfuls, squandering her beautiful gold pieces that she had been at such pains to polish with soap and ashes. The thought filled her with an unspeakable anguish. She would wake at night from a dream of Mcteague reveling down her money, and ask of the darkness, "How much did he spend today? How many of the gold pieces are left? Has he broken either of the two $20 pieces yet? What did he spend it for?" The instant she was out of the hospital, Trina had begun to save again. But now it was with an eagerness that amounted at times to a veritable frenzy. She even denied herself lights and fuel in order to put by a quarter or so, grudging every penny she was obliged to spend. She did her own washing and cooking, finally. She sold her wedding dress that had hitherto lain in the bottom of her trunk. The day she moved from Zerkal's old house, she came suddenly upon the dentist's concertina under a heap of old clothes in the closet. Within 20 minutes she had sold it to the dealer in second-hand furniture, returning to her room with $7 in her pocket, happy for the first time since Mcteague had left her. But for all that the matchbox and the bag refused to fill up, after 3 weeks of the most rigid economy they contained but $18 and some small change. What was that compared with 400? Trina told herself that she must have her money in hand. She longed to see again the heap of it upon her work table, where she could plunge her hands into it, her face into it, feeling the cool, smooth metal upon her cheeks. At such moments she would see in her imagination her wonderful $5,000 piled in columns, shining and gleaming somewhere at the bottom of Uncle Olibermann's vault. She would look at the paper that Uncle Olibermann had given her and tell herself that it represented $5,000. But in the end, this ceased to satisfy her. She must have the money itself. She must have her $400 back again, there in her trunk, in her bag and her matchbox, where she could touch it and see it whenever she desired. At length she could stand it no longer, and one day presented herself before Uncle Obermann as he sat in his office in the wholesale toy store, and told him she wanted to have $400 of her money. "But this is very irregular, you know, Mrs. Mcteague," said the great man. Not businesslike at all, but his niece's misfortunes and the sight of her poor maimed hand appealed to him. He opened his checkbook. "You understand, of course," he said, "that this will reduce the amount of your interest by just so much." I know, I've thought of that," said Trina. 400, did you say?" remarked Uncle Oldman, taking the cap from his fountain pen. "Yes, 400, exclaimed Trina quickly, her eyes glistening. Trina cashed the check and returned home with the money all in $20 pieces, as she had desired, in an ecstasy of delight. For half of that night she sat up playing with her money, counting it and recounting it, polishing the duller pieces until they shone. Altogether there were 20 $20 gold pieces. "Oh, hot, you beauties!" murmured Trina, running her palms over them, fairly quivering with pleasure. "You beauties! Is there anything prettier than a $20 gold piece? You dear, dear money! Oh, don't I love you! Mine, mine, mine! Mine, all of you mine!" She laid them out in a row on the ledge of the table, or arranged them in patterns, triangles, circles, and squares, or built them all up into a pyramid, which she afterward overthrew for the sake of hearing the delicious clink of the pieces tumbling against each other. Then at last she put them away in the brass matchbox and chamois bag, delighted beyond words that they were once more full and heavy. Then, a few days after, the thought of the money still remaining in Uncle Obermann's keeping returned to her. It was hers, all that 4,600. She could have as much of it or as little of it as she chose. She only had to ask. For a week Trina resisted, knowing very well that taking from her capital was proportionately reducing her monthly income. Then at last she yielded. Just to make it an even 500, anyhow, she told herself. That day she drew $100 more in $20 gold pieces as before. From that time Trina began to draw steadily upon her capital, a little at a time. It was a passion with her, a mania, a veritable mental disease, a temptation such as drunkards only know. It would come upon her all of a sudden, while she was about her work, scrubbing the floor of some vacant house, or in her room, in the morning, as she made her coffee on the oil stove, or when she woke in the night, a brusque access of cupidity would seize upon her. Her cheeks flushed, her eyes glistened, her breath came short. At times, she would leave her work just as it was, put on her old bonnet of black straw, throw her shawl about her, and go straight to Uncle Obermann's store and draw against her money. Now it would be $100, now 60. Now she would content herself with only 20, and once, after a fortnight's abstinence, she permitted herself a positive debauch of 500. Little by little she drew her capital from Uncle Obermann, and little by little her original interest of $25 a month dwindled. One day she presented herself again in the office of the wholesale toy store. "Will you let me have a check for $200, Uncle Obermann?" she said. The great man laid down his fountain pen and leaned back in his swivel chair with great deliberation. "I don't understand, Mrs. Mcteague," he said. "Every week you come here and draw out a little of your money. I've told you that it is not at all regular or businesslike for me to let you have it this way. And more than this, it's a great inconvenience to me to give you these checks at unstated times. If you wish to draw out the whole amount, let's have some understanding. Draw it in monthly. Installments of, say, $500, or else," he added abruptly, "draw it all at once, now, today. I would even prefer it that way. Otherwise, it's annoying. Come, shall I draw you a check for $3,700 and have it over and done with?" "No, no," cried Trina, with instinctive apprehension, refusing she did not know why. "No, I'll leave it with you. I won't draw out any more." She took her departure, but paused on the pavement outside the store and stood for a moment lost in thought, her eyes beginning to glisten and her breath coming short. Slowly she turned about and re-entered the store. She came back into the office and stood trembling at the corner of Uncle Obermann's desk. He looked up sharply. Twice Trina tried to get her voice, and when it did come to her, she could hardly recognize it. Between breaths she said, "Yes, all right, will you give me a check for $3,700? Give me all of my money." A few hours later she entered her little room over the kindergarten, bolted the door with shaking fingers, and emptied a heavy canvas sack upon the middle of her bed. Then she opened her trunk, and taking thence the brass matchbox and chamois skin bag, added their contents to the pile. Next she laid herself upon the bed and gathered the gleaming heaps of gold pieces to her with both arms, burying her face in them with long sighs of unspeakable delight. It was a little past noon, and the day was fine and warm. The leaves of the huge cherry trees threw off a certain pungent aroma that entered through the open window, together with long, thin shafts of golden sunlight. Below, in the kindergarten, the children were singing gaily and marching to the jangling of the piano. Trina heard nothing, saw nothing. She lay on her bed, her eyes closed, her face buried in a pile of gold that she encircled with both her arms. Trina even told herself at last that she was happy once more. Mcteague became a memory that faded a little every day, dim and indistinct in the golden splendor of $5,000. And yet, Trina would say, I did love Mac, loved him dearly, only a little while ago. Even when he hurt me, it only made me love him more. How is it I've changed so sudden? How could I forget him so soon? It must be because he stole my money. That is it. I couldn't forgive anyone that not even my mother, and I never will forgive him. What had become of her husband Trina did not know. She never saw any of the old Polk Street people. There was no way she could have news of him. Even if she had cared to have it, she had her money, that was the main thing. Her passion for it excluded every other sentiment. There it was in the bottom of her trunk, in the canvas sack, the chamois skin bag, and the little brass match safe. Not a day. Past that, Trina did not have it out where she could see and touch it. One evening she had even spread all the gold pieces between the sheets and had then gone to bed, stripping herself, and had slept all night upon the money, taking a strange and ecstatic pleasure in the touch of the smooth, flat pieces the length of her entire body. One night, some 3 months after she had come to live at the kindergarten, Trina was awakened by a sharp tap on the pane of the window. She sat up quickly in bed, her heart beating thickly, her eyes rolling wildly in the direction of her trunk. The tap was repeated. Trina rose and went fearfully to the window. The little court below was bright with moonlight, and standing just on the edge of the shadow thrown by one of the cherry trees was Mcteague. A bunch of half-ripe cherries was in his hand. He was eating them and throwing the pits at the window. As he caught sight of her, he made an eager sign for her to raise the sash. Reluctant and wondering, Trina obeyed, and the dentist came quickly forward. He was wearing a pair of blue overalls, a navy blue flannel shirt without a cravat, an old coat, faded, rain-washed, and ripped at the seams, and his woolen cap. "Say, Trina," he exclaimed, his heavy bass voice pitched just above a whisper, "let me in, will you, huh? Say, will you? I'm regularly starving, and I haven't slept in a Christian bed for 2 weeks." At sight, at him standing there in the moonlight, Trina could only think of him as the man who had beaten and bitten her, had deserted her and stolen her money, had made her suffer as she had never suffered before in all her life. Now that he had spent the money that he had stolen from her, he was whining to come back so that he might steal more, no doubt. Once in her room, he could not help but smell out her $5,000. Her indignation rose. "No," she whispered back at him. "No, I will not let you in." "But listen here, Trina, I tell you I am starving, regularly." "Ho!" interrupted Trina scornfully. "A man can't starve with $400, I guess." Well, faltered the dentist. "Never mind now. Give me something to eat and let me in and sleep. I've been sleeping in the plaza for the last 10 nights, and damn it, Trina, I ain't had anything to eat since. Where's the $400 you robbed me of when you deserted me?" returned Trina coldly. "Well, I've spent it," growled the dentist. "But you can't see me starve, Trina, no matter what's happened. Give me a little money. Then I'll see you starve before you get any more of my money." The dentist stepped back a pace and stared up at her wonder-stricken. His face was lean and pinched. Never had the jawbone looked so enormous, nor the square-cut head so huge. The moonlight made deep black shadows in the shrunken cheeks. "Huh?" asked the dentist, puzzled. "What did you say?" "I won't give you any money, never again, not a cent." "But do you know that I'm hungry?" "Well, I've been hungry myself. Besides, I don't believe you." "Trina, I ain't had a thing to eat since yesterday morning. That's God's truth. Even if I did get off with your money, you can see me starve, can you? You can't see me walk the streets all night because I ain't got a place to sleep. Will you let me in? Say, will you? Huh?" "No." "Well, will you give me some money then, just a little? Give me $1. Give me half a dole. Say, give me a dime and I can get a cup of coffee." "No." The dentist paused and looked at her with curious intentness, bewildered, nonplussed. "Say, you must be crazy, Trina. I wouldn't let a dog go hungry. Not even if he'd bitten you, perhaps." The dentist stared again. There was another pause. Mcteague looked up at her in silence, a mean and vicious twinkle coming into his small eyes. He uttered a low exclamation and then checked himself. "Well, look here, for the last time, I'm starving. I've got nowhere to sleep. Will you give me some money or something to eat? Will you let me in? No, no." Trina could fancy she almost saw the brassy glint in her husband's eyes. He raised one enormous lean fist. Then he growled, "If I had hold of you for a minute, by God, I'd make you dance, and I will yet, don't you be afraid of that." He turned about, the moonlight showing like a layer of snow upon his massive shoulders. Trina watched him as he passed under the shadow of the cherry trees and crossed the little court. She heard his great feet grinding on the board flooring. He disappeared. Miser though she was, Trina was only human, and the echo of the dentist's heavy feet had not died away before she began to be sorry for what she had done. She stood by the open window in her nightgown, her finger upon her lips. "He did look pinched," she said half aloud. "Maybe he was hungry. I ought to have given him something. I wish I had. Oh," she cried suddenly, with a frightened gesture of both hands. "What have I come to be that I would see Mac my husband, that I would see him starve rather than give him money? No, no, it's too dreadful. I will give him some. I'll send it to him tomorrow. Where? Well, he'll come back." She leaned from the window and called as loudly as she dared, "Mac, oh Mac!" There was no answer. When Mcteague had told Trina he had been without food for nearly 2 days, he was speaking the truth. The week before he had spent the last of the $400 in the bar of a sailor's lodging house near the waterfront, and since that time had lived a veritable hand-to-mouth existence. He had spent her money here and there about the city in royal fashion, absolutely reckless of the morrow, feasting and drinking for the most part with companions. He picked up heaven knows where, acquaintances of 24 hours whose names he forgot in 2 days. Then suddenly he found himself at the end of his money. He no longer had any friends. Hunger rode him and rowelled him. He was no longer well-fed, comfortable. There was no longer a warm place for him to sleep. He went back to Polk Street in the evening, walking on the dark side of the street, lurking in the shadows, ashamed to have any of his old-time friends see him. He entered Zerkow's old house and knocked at the door of the room Trina and he had occupied. It was empty. Next day he went to Uncle Obermann's store and asked news of Trina. Trina had not told Uncle Obermann of Mcteague's brutalities, giving him other reasons to explain the loss of her fingers. Neither had she told him of her husband's robbery. So when the dentist had asked where Trina could be found, Uncle Obermann, believing that Mcteague was seeking a reconciliation, had told him without hesitation, and he added, "She was in here only yesterday and drew out the balance of her money. She's been drawing against her money for the last month or so. She's got it all now, I guess." "Ah, she's got it all." The dentist went away from his bootless visit to his wife, shaking with rage, hating her with all the strength of a crude and primitive nature. He clenched his fists till his knuckles whitened, his teeth ground furiously upon one another. "Ah, if I had hold of you once, I'd make you dance." She had $5,000 in that room, while I stood there, not 20 feet away, and told her I was starving, and she wouldn't give me a dime to get a cup of coffee with. Not a dime to get a cup of coffee. Oh, if I once get my hands on you. His wrath strangled him. He clutched at the darkness in front of him, his breath fairly whistling between his teeth. That night he walked the streets until the morning, wondering what now he was to do to fight the wolf away. The morning of the next day, towards 10 o'clock, he was on Kearney Street, still walking, still tramping the streets, since there was nothing else for him to do. By and by he paused on the corner near a music store, finding a momentary amusement in watching 2 or 3 men loading a piano upon a dray. Already half its weight was supported by the dray's backboard. One of the men, a big mulatto, almost hidden under the mass of glistening rosewood, was guiding its course, while the other 2 heaved and tugged in the rear. Something in the street frightened the horses, and they shied. Abruptly, the end of the piano was twitched sharply from the backboard. There was a cry. The mulatto staggered and fell with the falling piano, and its weight dropped squarely upon his thigh, which broke with a resounding crack. An hour later, Mcteague had found his job. The music store engaged him as handler at $6 a week. Mcteague's enormous strength, useless all his life, stood him in good stead at last. He slept in a tiny back room opening from the storeroom of the music store. He was in some sense a watchman as well as handler, and went the rounds of the store twice every night. His room was a box of a place that reeked with odors of stale tobacco smoke. The former occupant had papered the walls with newspapers and had pasted up figures cut out from the posters of some Carolfi ballet, very gaudy. By the one window, chittering all day in its little gilt prison, hung the canary bird, a tiny atom of life that Mcteague still clung to with strange obstinacy. Mcteague drank a good deal of whiskey in these days, but the only effect it had upon him was to increase the viciousness and bad temper that had developed in him since the beginning of his misfortunes. He terrorized his fellow handlers, powerful men though they were, for a gruff word, for an awkward movement in lading the pianos, for a surly look or a muttered oath. The dentist's elbow with crook in his hand contract to a mallet-like fist. As often as not the blow followed, colossal in its force, swift as the leap of the piston from its cylinder. His hatred of Trina increased from day to day. He'd make her dance yet, wait only till he got his hands upon her. She'd let him starve, would she? She'd turn him out of doors while she hid her $5,000 in the bottom of her trunk. Aha, he would see about that some day. She couldn't make small of him. Ah, no, she'd dance all right, all right. Mcteague was not an imaginative man by nature, but he would lie awake nights, his clumsy wits galloping and frisking under the lash of the alcohol, and fancy himself thrashing his wife, till a sudden frenzy of rage would overcome him, and he would shake all over, rolling upon the bed and biting the mattress. On a certain day, about a week after Christmas of that year, Mcteague was on one of the top floors of the music store where the second-hand instruments were kept, helping to move about and rearrange some old pianos. As he passed by one of the counters, he paused abruptly, his eye caught by an object that was strangely familiar. "Say," he inquired, addressing the clerk in charge. "Say, where'd this come from?" "Why, let's see. We got that from a second-hand store up on Polk Street, I guess. It's a fairly good machine, a little tinkering with the stops and a bit of shellac, and we'll make it about's good as new. Good tone, see." And the clerk drew a long, sonorous wail from the depths of Mcteague's old concertina. "Well, it's mine," growled the dentist. The other laughed. "It's yours for $11. "It's mine," growled the dentist. The other laughed. "It's yours for $11. "It's mine," persisted Mcteague. "I want it." "Go 'long with ye, Mac. What do you mean?" "I mean that it's mine. That's what I mean. You got no right to it. It was thestalin from me. That's what I mean," he added, a sullen anger flaming up in his little eyes. The clerk raised a shoulder and put the concertina on an upper shelf. "You talk to the boss about that. 'Tain't none of my affair. If you want to buy it, it's $11. The dentist had been paid off the day before and had $4 in his wallet at the moment. He gave the money to the clerk. "Here, there's part of the money. You put that concertina aside for me, and I'll give you the rest in a week or so." "I'll give it to you tomorrow," he exclaimed, struck with a sudden idea. Mcteague had sadly missed his concertina. Sunday afternoons, when there was no work to be done, he was accustomed to lie flat on his back on his springless bed in the little room in the rear of the music store, his coat and shoes off, reading the paper, drinking steam beer from a pitcher, and smoking his pipe. But he could no longer play his 6 lugubrious airs upon his concertina, and it was a deprivation. He often wondered where it was gone. It had been lost, no doubt, in the general wreck of his fortunes. Once even the dentist had taken a concertina from the lock kept by the music store. It was a Sunday, and no one was about. But he found he could not play upon it. The stops were arranged upon a system he did not understand. Now his own concertina was come back to him. He would buy it back. He had given the clerk $4. He knew where he would get the remaining $7. The clerk had told him the concertina had been sold on Polk Street to the second-hand store there. Trina had sold it. Mcteague knew it. Trina had sold. His concertina had stolen it, and sold it, his concertina, his beloved concertina, that he had had all his life. Why, barring the canary, there was not one of all his belongings that Mcteague had cherished more dearly. His steel engraving of Lorenzo de' Medici and his court might be lost. His stone pug dog might go. But his concertina, and she sold it, stole it from me and sold it, just because I happened to forget to take it along with me. Well, we'll just see about that. You'll give me the money to buy it back, or— His rage loomed big within him. His hatred of Trina came back upon him like a returning surge. He saw her small, prim mouth, her narrow blue eyes, her black mane of hair and up-tilted chin, and hated her the more because of them. Aha! He'd show her. He'd make her dance. He'd get that $7 from her, or he'd know the reason why. He went through his work that day, heaving and hauling at the ponderous pianos, handling them with the ease of a lifting crane, impatient for the coming of evening, when he could be left to his own devices. As often as he had a moment to spare, he went down the street to the nearest saloon and drank a pony of whiskey. Now and then, as he fought and struggled with the vast masses of ebony, rosewood, and mahogany on the upper floor of the music store, raging and chafing at their inertness and unwillingness, while the whiskey pirouetted in his brain, he would mutter to himself, "And I got to do this. I got to work like a dray horse while she sits at home by her stove and counts her money and sells my concertina." 6 o'clock came. Instead of supper, Mcteague drank some more whiskey, 5 ponies in rapid succession. After supper, he was obliged to go out with the dray to deliver a concert grand at the Odd Fellows Hall, where a piano recital was to take place. "Ain't you comin' back with us?" asked one of the handlers as he climbed upon the driver's seat after the piano had been put in place. "No, no," returned the dentist. "I got something else to do." The brilliant lights of a saloon near the city hall caught his eye. He decided he would have another drink of whiskey. It was about 8 o'clock. The following day was to be a fete day at the kindergarten. The Christmas and New Year festivals combined. All that afternoon, the little 2-story building on Pacific Street had been filled with a number of grand ladies of the kindergarten board, who were hanging up ropes of evergreen and sprays of holly and arranging a great Christmas tree that stood in the center of the ring in the schoolroom. The whole place was pervaded with a pungent piney odor. Trina had been very busy since the early morning, coming and going at everybody's call, now running down the street after another tack hammer or a fresh supply of cranberries, now tying together the ropes of evergreen and passing them up to one of the grand ladies as she carefully balanced herself on a stepladder. By evening everything was in place. As the last grand lady left the school, she gave Trina an extra $1 for her work and said, "Now, if you'll just tidy up here, Mrs. Mcteague, I think that will be all. Sweep up the pine needles. Here you see they are all over the floor, and look through all the rooms, and tidy up generally. Good night, and a Happy New Year," she cried pleasantly as she went out. Trina put the $1 away in her trunk before she did anything else, and cooked herself a bit of supper. Then she came downstairs again. The kindergarten was not large. On the lower floor were but 2 rooms, the main schoolroom and another room, a cloakroom, very small, where the children hung their hats and coats. This cloakroom opened off the back of the main schoolroom. Trina cast a critical glance into both of these rooms. There had been a great deal of going and coming in them during the day, and she decided that the first thing to do would be to scrub the floors. She went up again to her room overhead and heated some water over her oil stove, then, redescending, set to work vigorously. By 9 o'clock, she had almost finished with the schoolroom. She was down on her hands and knees in the midst of a steaming muck of soapy water. On her feet were a pair of man's shoes fastened with buckles. A dirty cotton gown, damp with the water, clung about her shapeless, stunted figure. From time to time she sat back on her heels to ease the strain of her position, and with one smoking hand, white and parboiled with the hot water, brushed her hair, already streaked with gray, out of her weazened, pale face and the corners of her mouth. It was very quiet. A gas jet without a globe lit up the place with a crude raw light. The cat who lived on the premises, preferring to be dirty rather than to be wet, had got into the coal scuttle, and over its rim watched her sleepily with a long, complacent purr. All at once he stopped purring, leaving an abrupt silence in the air, like the sudden shutting off of a stream of water, while his eyes grew wide, two lambent discs of yellow in the heap of black fur. "Who is there?" cried Trina, sitting back on her heels. In the stillness that succeeded, the water dripped from her hands with the steady tick of a clock. Then a brutal fist swung open the street door of the schoolroom and Mcteague came in. He was drunk, not with that drunkenness which is stupid, maudlin, wavering on its feet, but with that which is alert, unnaturally intelligent, vicious, perfectly steady, deadly wicked. Trina only had to look once at him, and in an instant, with some strange sixth sense, born of the occasion, knew what she had to expect. She jumped up and ran from him into the little cloakroom. She locked and bolted the door after her, and leaned her weight against it, panting and trembling, every nerve shrinking and quivering with the fear of him. Mcteague put his hand on the knob of the door outside and opened it, tearing off the lock and bolt guard, and sending her staggering across the room. "Mac!" she cried to him as he came in, speaking with horrid rapidity, cringing and holding out her hands. "Mac, listen. Wait a minute. Look here. Listen here. It wasn't my fault. I'll give you some money. You can come back. I'll do anything you want. Won't you just listen to me?" "Oh, don't. I'll scream. I can't help it, you know. The people will hear." Mcteague came towards her slowly, his immense feet dragging and grinding on the floor, his enormous fists, hard as wooden mallets, swinging at his sides. Trina backed from him to the corner of the room, cowering before him, holding her elbow crooked in front of her face, watching him with fearful intentness, ready to dodge. "I want that money," he said, pausing in front of her. "What money?" cried Trina. "I want that money. You got it, that $5,000. I want every nickel of it. You understand? I haven't. It isn't here. Uncle Obermann's got it. That's a lie. He told me that you came and got it. You've had it long enough. Now I want it. Do you hear? Mac, I can't give you that money. I won't give it to you," Trina cried with sudden resolution. "Yes, you will. You'll give me every nickel of it. No, you ain't going to make small of me this time. Give me that money. No." "For the last time, will you give me that money?" "No." "You won't, huh? You won't give me it? For the last time. No." "No." Usually the dentist was slow in his movements, but now the alcohol had awakened in him an ape-like agility. He kept his small eyes upon her, and all at once sent his fist into the middle of her face with the suddenness of a relaxed spring. Beside herself with terror, Trina turned and fought him back, fought for her miserable life with the exasperation and strength of a harassed cat, and with such energy and such wild, unnatural force that even Mcteague for the moment drew back from her. But her resistance was the one thing to drive him to the top of his fury. He came back at her again, his eyes drawn to two fine twinkling points, and his enormous fists clenched till the knuckles whitened, raised in the air. Then it became abominable. In the schoolroom outside, behind the coal scuttle, the cat listened to the sounds of stamping and struggling and the muffled noise of blows, wildly terrified, his eyes bulging like brass knobs. At last the sound stopped on a sudden. He heard nothing more. Then Mcteague came out, closing the door. The cat followed him with distended eyes as he crossed the room and disappeared through the street door. The dentist paused for a moment on the sidewalk, looking carefully up and down the street. It was deserted and quiet. He turned sharply to the right and went down a narrow passage that led into the little courtyard behind the school. A candle was burning in Trina's room. He went up by the outside stairway and entered. The trunk stood locked in one corner of the room. The dentist took the lid lifter from the little oil stove, put it underneath the lock clasp and wrenched it open. Groping beneath a pile of dresses, he found the chamois skin bag, the little brass matchbox, and, at the very bottom, carefully thrust into one corner, the canvas sack crammed to the mouth with $20 gold pieces. He emptied the chamois skin bag and the matchbox into the pockets of his trousers. But the canvas sack was too bulky to hide about his clothes. "I guess I'll just naturally have to carry you," he muttered. He blew out the candle, closed the door, and gained the street again. The dentist crossed the city, going back to the music store. It was a little after 11 o'clock. The night was moonless, filled with a gray blur of faint light that seemed to come from all quarters of the horizon at once. From time to time, there were sudden explosions of a southeast wind at the street corners. Mcteague went on, slanting his head against the gusts to keep his cap from blowing off, carrying the sack close to his side. Once he looked critically at the sky. "I bet it'll rain tomorrow," he muttered, "if this wind works round to the south." Once in his little den behind the music store, he washed his hands and forearms and put on his working clothes, blue overalls and a jumper, over cheap trousers and vest. Then he got together his small belongings, an old campaign hat, a pair of boots, a tin of tobacco, and a pinchbeck bracelet which he had found one Sunday in the park and which he believed to be valuable. He stripped his blanket from his bed and rolled up in it all these objects, together with the canvas sack, fastening the roll with a half-hitch such as miners use, the instincts of the old-time car boy coming back to him in his present confusion of mind. He changed his pipe and his knife, a huge jackknife with a yellowed bone handle, to the pockets of his overalls. Then at last he stood with his hand on the door, holding up the lamp before blowing it out, looking about to make sure he was ready to go. The wavering light woke his canary. It stirred and began to chitter feebly, very sleepy and cross at being awakened. Mcteague started, staring at it and reflecting. He believed that it would be a long time before anyone came into that room again. The canary would be days without food. It was likely it would starve, would die there, hour by hour, in its little gilt prison. Mcteague resolved to take it with him. He took down the cage, touching it gently with his enormous hands, and tied a couple of sacks about it to shelter the little bird from the sharp night wind. Then he went out, locking all the doors behind him, and turned toward the ferry slips. The boats had ceased running hours ago, but he told himself that by waiting till 4 o'clock he could get across the bay on the tug that took over the morning papers. Trina lay unconscious, just as she had fallen under the last of Mcteague's blows, her body twitching with an occasional hiccough that stirred the pool of blood in which she lay face downward. Towards morning she died with a rapid series of hiccoughs that sounded like a piece of clockwork running down. The thing had been done in the cloakroom where the kindergarten children hung their hats and coats. There was no other entrance except by going through the main schoolroom. Mcteague, going out, had shut the door of the cloakroom but had left the street door open, so when the children arrived in the morning, they entered as usual. About 8:30, 2 or 3 5-year-olds, one a little colored girl, came into the schoolroom of the kindergarten with a great chatter of voices, going across to the cloakroom to hang up their hats and coats as they had been taught. Halfway across the room one of them stopped and put her small nose in the air, crying, oh, what a funny smell." The others began to sniff the air as well, and one, the daughter of a butcher, exclaimed, "Smells like my past shop," adding in the next breath, "Look, what's the matter with the kitty?" In fact, the cat was acting strangely. He lay quite flat on the floor, his nose pressed close to the crevice under the door of the little cloakroom, winding his tail slowly back and forth, excited, very eager. At times he would draw back and make a strange little clacking noise down in his throat. "Ain't he funny?" said the little girl again. The cat slunk swiftly away as the children came up. Then the tallest of the little girls swung the door of the little cloakroom wide open, and they all ran in. Chapter 20. The day was very hot, and the silence of high noon lay close and thick between the steep slopes of the cañons, like an invisible muffling fluid. At intervals the drone of an insect bored the air and trailed slowly to silence again. Everywhere were pungent, aromatic smells. The vast, moveless heat seemed to distill countless odors from the brush odors of warm sap, of pine needles, and of tarweed, and above all the medicinal odor of witch hazel. As far as one could look, uncounted multitudes of trees and manzanita bushes were quietly and motionlessly growing, growing. A tremendous, immeasurable life pushed steadily heavenward without a sound, without a motion. At turns of the road, on the higher points, cañons disclosed themselves far away, gigantic grooves in the landscape, deep blue in the distance, opening one into another, ocean deep, silent, huge, and suggestive of colossal primeval forces held in reserve. At their bottoms they were solid, massive. On their crests they broke delicately into fine serrated edges, where the pines and redwoods outlined their million of tops. Against the high white horizon, here and there the mountains lifted themselves out of the narrow riverbeds in groups like giant lions rearing their heads after drinking. The entire region was untamed. In some places east of the Mississippi nature is cozy, intimate, small, and homelike, like a good-natured housewife. In Placer County, California, she is a vast unconquered brute of the Pliocene epoch, savage, sullen, and magnificently indifferent to man. But there were men in these mountains, like lice on mammoths' hides, fighting them stubbornly, now with hydraulic monitors, now with drill and dynamite, boring into the vitals of them or tearing away great yellow gravelly scars in the flanks of them, sucking their blood, extracting gold. Here and there at long distances upon the cañon sides rose the headgear of a mine, surrounded with its few unpainted houses and topped by its never-failing feather of black smoke. On near approach one heard the prolonged thunder of the stamp mill, the crusher, the insatiable monster, gnashing the rocks to powder with its long iron teeth, vomiting them out again in a thin stream of wet gray mud. Its enormous maw fed night and day with the carboys' loads, gorged itself with gravel, and spat out the gold, grinding the rocks between its jaws, glutted, as it were, with the very entrails of the earth, and growling over its endless meal, like some savage animal, some legendary dragon, some fabulous beast, symbol of inordinate and monstrous gluttony. Mcteague had left the overland train at Colfax, and the same afternoon had ridden some 8 miles across the mountains in the stage that connects Colfax with Iowa Hill. Iowa Hill was a small one-street town, the headquarters of the mines of the district. Originally, it had been built upon the summit of a mountain, but the sides of this mountain have long since been hydraulicked away, so that the town now clings to a mere backbone, and the rear windows of the houses on both sides of the street look down over sheer precipices into vast pits hundreds of feet deep. The dentist stayed overnight at the hill, and the next morning started off on foot farther into the mountains. He still wore his blue overalls and jumper. His woolen cap was pulled down over his eye. On his feet were hobnailed boots he had bought at the store in Colfax. His blanket roll was over his back. In his left hand swung the birdcage wrapped in sacks. Just outside the town he paused, as if suddenly remembering something. "There ought to be a trail just off the road here," he muttered. There used to be a trail, a shortcut. The next instant, without moving from his position, he saw where it opened just before him. His instinct had halted him at the exact spot. The trail zigzagged down the abrupt descent of a cañon, debouching into a gravelly riverbed. "Indian River," muttered the dentist. I remember. I ought to hear the morning star's stamps from here." He cocked his head. A low, sustained roar, like a distant cataract, came to his ears from across the river. "That's right," he said, contentedly. He crossed the river and regained the road beyond. The slope rose under his feet. A little farther on he passed the Morning Star mine, smoking and thundering. Mcteague pushed steadily on. The road rose with the rise of the mountain, turned at a sharp angle where a great live oak grew, and held level for nearly a quarter of a mile. Twice again the dentist left the road and took to the trail that cut through deserted hydraulic pits. He knew exactly where to look for these trails. Not once did his instinct deceive him. He recognized familiar points at once. Here was Cold Cañon, where invariably winter and summer a chilly wind was blowing. Here was where the road to Spencer's branched off. Here was Bussey's old place, where at one time there were so many dogs. Here was Delmue's cabin, where unlicensed whiskey used to be sold. Here was the plank bridge with ale, its one rotten board, and here the flat overgrown with manzanita, where he once had shot 3 quail. At noon, after he had been tramping for some 2 hours, he halted at a point where the road dipped suddenly. A little to the right of him, and flanking the road, an enormous yellow gravel pit like an emptied lake gapes to heaven. Farther on, in the distance, a cañon zigzagged toward the horizon, rugged with pine-clad mountain crests. Nearer at hand, and directly in the line of the road, was an irregular cluster of unpainted cabins. A dull, prolonged roar vibrated in the air. Mcteague nodded his head as if satisfied. "That's the place," he muttered. He reshouldered his blanket roll and descended the road. At last he halted again. He stood before a low 1-story building, differing from the others in that it was painted. A veranda, shut in with mosquito netting, surrounded it. Mcteague dropped his blanket roll on a lumber pile outside and came up and knocked at the open door. Someone called to him to come in. Mcteague entered, rolling his eyes about him, noting the changes that had been made since he had last seen this place. A partition had been knocked down, making one big room out of the 2 former small ones. A counter and railing stood inside the door. There was a telephone on the wall. In one corner he also observed a stack of surveyor's instruments. A big drawing board straddled on spindle legs across one end of the room. A mechanical drawing of some kind, no doubt the plan of the mine, unrolled upon it. A chromo representing a couple of peasants in a plowed field, Millet's Angelus, was nailed unframed upon the wall, and hanging from the same wire nail that secured one of its corners in place was a bullion bag and a cartridge belt with a colligated horologe for revolver. The dentist approached the counter and leaned his elbows upon it. 3 men were in the room, a tall, lean young man with a thick head of hair surprisingly gray, who was playing with a half-grown Great Dane puppy. Another fellow, about as young, but with a jaw almost as salient as Mcteague's, stood at the letterpress taking a copy of a letter. A third man, a little older than the other 2, was pottering over a transit. This latter was massively built, and wore overalls and low boots, streaked and stained and spotted in every direction with gray mud. The dentist looked slowly from one to the other. Then at length, "Is the foreman about?" he asked. The man in the muddy overalls came forward. "What you want?" He spoke with a strong German accent. The old invariable formula came back to Mcteague on the instant. "What's the show for a job?" At once the German foreman became preoccupied, looking aimlessly out of the window. There was a silence. "You have been minor heredity, yes, yes. Know how to handle pick shovel? Yes, yes. Know how to handle pick shovel? Yes, I know." The other seemed unsatisfied. "Are you a cousin Jack?" The dentist grinned. This prejudice against Cornishmen he remembered too. "No. American." "How long since you mine?" "Oh, year or two, hens." "Show your hens." Mcteague exhibited his hard, calloused palms. "When can you go to work?" "I want to chuck tender under night shift." "I can tend to chuck." "I'll go on tonight." "What's your name?" the dentist started. He had forgotten to be prepared for this. "Huh! What? What's the name?" Mcteague's eye was caught by a railroad calendar hanging over the desk. There? What? Was no time to think. "Burlington," he said loudly. The German took a card from a file and wrote it down. "Give dis card to der boarding boss down at der boarding house, den Joe find me be der mill at 6 o'clock. I set you to work." Straight as a homing pigeon and following a blind and unreasoned instinct, Mcteague had returned to the Big Dipper mine. Within a week's time it seemed to him as though he had never been away. He picked up his life again exactly where he had left it the day when his mother had sent him away with the traveling dentist, the charlatan who had set up his tent by the bunkhouse. The house Mcteague had once lived in was still there, occupied by one of the shift bosses and his family. The dentist passed it on his way to and from the mine. He himself slept in the bunkhouse with some 30 others of his shift. At 5:30 in the evening, the cook at the boarding house sounded a prolonged alarm upon a crowbar bent in the form of a triangle that hung upon the porch of the boarding house. Mcteague rose and dressed, and with his shift had supper. Their lunch pails were distributed to them. Then he made his way to the tunnel mouth, climbed into a car in the waiting ore train, and was hauled into the mine. Once inside, the hot evening air turned to a cool dampness, and the forest odors gave place to the smell of stale dynamite smoke suggestive of burning rubber. A cloud of steam came from Mcteague's mouth. Underneath, the water swashed and rippled around the car wheels, while the light from the miners' candlesticks threw wavering blurs of pale yellow over the gray, rotting quartz of the roof and walls. Occasionally, Mcteague bent down his head to avoid the lacking of the roof or the projections of an overhanging chute. From car to car all along the line, the miners called to one another as the train trundled along, joshing and laughing. A mile from the entrance, the train reached the breast where Mcteague's gang worked. The men clambered from the cars and took up the labor where the day shift had left it, burrowing their way steadily through a primeval riverbed. The candlesticks thrust into the crevices of the gravel strata lit up faintly the half-dozen moving figures befouled with sweat and with wet gray mold. The picks struck into the loose gravel with a yielding shock. The long-handled shovels clinked amidst the piles of boulders and scraped dully in the heaps of rotten quartz. The burly drill boring for blasts broke out from time to time in an irregular chug-chug-chug-chug, while the engine that pumped the water from the mine coughed and strangled at short intervals. Mcteague tended the chuck. In a way he was the assistant of the man who worked the burley. It was his duty to replace the drills in the burley, putting in longer ones as the hole got deeper and deeper. From time to time he rapped the drill with the pole pick when it stuck fast or fitchered. Once it even occurred to him that there was a resemblance between his present work and the profession he had been forced to abandon. In the burley drill he saw a queer counterpart of his old-time dental engine. And what were the drills and chucks but enormous hoe excavators, hard bits, and burrs? It was the same work he had so often performed in his parlors, only magnified, made monstrous, distorted, and grotesque, the caricature of dentistry. He passed his nights thus in the midst of the play of crude and simple forces, the powerful attacks of the burly drills, the great exertions of bared, bent backs overlaid with muscle, the brusque, resistless expansion of dynamite, and the silent, vast titanic force, mysterious and slow, that cracked the timbers, supporting the roof of the tunnel, and that gradually flattened the lagging till it was thin as paper. The life pleased the dentist beyond words. The still, colossal mountains took him back again like a returning prodigal, and vaguely, without knowing why, he yielded to their influence, their immensity, their enormous power, crude and blind, reflecting themselves in his own nature, huge, strong, brutal in its simplicity. And this, though we only saw the mountains at night. They appeared far different then than in the daytime. At 12 o'clock he came out of the mine and lunched on the contents of his dinner pail, sitting upon the embankment of the track, eating with both hands and looking around him with a steady ox-like gaze. The mountains rose sheer from every side, heaving their gigantic crests far up into the night, the black peaks crowding together, and looking now less like beasts than like a company of cowled giants. In the daytime they were silent, but at night they seemed to stir and rouse themselves. Occasionally the stamp mill stopped, its thunder ceasing abruptly. Then one could hear the noises that the mountains made in their living. From the cañon, from the crowding crests, from the whole immense landscape, there rose a steady and prolonged sound, coming from all sides at once. It was that incessant and muffled roar which disengages itself from all vast bodies, from oceans, from cities, from forests, from sleeping armies, and which is like the breathing of an infinitely great monster, alive, palpitating. Mcteague returned to his work. At 6 in the morning his shift was taken off, and he went out of the mine and back to the bunkhouse. All day long he slept, flung at length upon the strong-smelling blankets, slept the dreamless sleep of exhaustion, crushed and overpowered with the work, flat and prone upon his belly, till again in the evening the cook sounded the alarm upon the crowbar, bent into a triangle. Every alternate week the shifts were changed. The second week Mcteague's shift worked in the daytime and slept at night. Wednesday night of the second week the dentist woke suddenly. He sat up in his bed in the bunkhouse, looking about him from side to side, an alarm clock hanging on the wall, over a lantern marked 3:30. "What was it?" muttered the dentist. "I wonder what it was." The rest of the shift were sleeping soundly, filling the room with the rasping sound of snoring. Everything was in its accustomed place, nothing stirred. But for all that Mcteague got up and lit his miner's candlestick and went carefully about the room, throwing the light into the dark corners, peering under all the beds, including his own. Then he went to the door and stepped outside. The night was warm and still, the moon very low and canted on her side like a galleon foundering. The camp was very quiet, nobody was in sight. "I wonder what it was," muttered the dentist. "There was something. Why did I wake up? Huh!" He made a circuit about the bunkhouse, unusually alert, his small eyes twinkling rapidly, seeing everything. All was quiet. An old dog who invariably slept on the steps of the bunkhouse had not even wakened. Mcteague went back to bed, but did not sleep. "There was something," he muttered, looking in a puzzled way at his canary in the cage that hung from the wall at his bedside. "Something. What was it? There is something now. There it is again, the same thing." He sat up in bed with eyes and ears strained. "What is it? I don't know what it is. I don't hear anything and I don't see anything. I feel something right now, feel it now. I wonder, I don't know, I don't know." Once more he got up and this time dressed himself. He made a complete tour of the camp, looking and listening for what he did not know. He even went to the outskirts of the camp, and for nearly half an hour watched the road that led into the camp from the direction of Iowa Hill. He saw nothing, not even a rabbit stirred. He went to bed. But from this time on there was a change. The dentist grew restless, uneasy. Suspicion of something, he could not say what, annoyed him incessantly. He went wide around sharp corners. At every moment he looked sharply over his shoulder. He even went to bed with his clothes and cap on, and at every hour during the night would get up and prowl about the bunkhouse, one ear turned down the wind, his eyes gimleting the darkness. From time to time he would murmur, "There's something. What is it? I wonder what it is." What strange sixth sense stirred in Mcteague at this time? What animal cunning, what brute instinct clamored for recognition and obedience? What lower faculty was it that roused his suspicion, that drove him out into the night a score of times between dark and dawn, his head in the air, his eyes and ears keenly alert? One night, as he stood on the steps of the bunkhouse, peering into the shadows of the camp, he uttered an exclamation as of a man suddenly enlightened. He turned back into the house, drew from under his bed the blanket roll in which he kept his money hid, and took the canary down from the wall. He strode to the door and disappeared into the night. When the sheriff of Placer County and the 2 deputies from San Francisco reached the Big Dipper mine, Mcteague had been gone 2 days. Chapter 21. "Well," said one of the deputies, as he backed the horse into the shafts of the buggy in which the pursuers had driven over from the hill, "we've about as good as got him. It isn't hard to follow a man who carries a bird cage with him wherever he goes." Mcteague crossed the mountains on foot the Friday and Saturday of that week, going over through Emigrant Gap, following the line of the Overland Railroad. He reached Reno Monday night. By degrees a vague plan of action outlined itself in the dentist's mind. "Mexico," he muttered to himself. "Mexico. That's the place. They'll watch the coast and they'll watch the eastern trains, but they won't think of Mexico." The sense of pursuit which had harassed him during the last week of his stay at the Big Dipper mine had worn off, and he believed himself to be very cunning. "I'm pretty far ahead now, I guess," he said. At Reno, he boarded a southbound freight on the line of the Carson and Colorado Railroad, paying for a passage in the caboose. "Freights don't run on schedule time," he muttered, "and a conductor on a passenger train makes it his business to study faces. I'll stay with this train as far as it goes." The freight worked slowly southward through western Nevada, the country becoming hourly more and more desolate and abandoned. After leaving Walker Lake, the sagebrush country began, and the freight rolled heavily over tracks that threw off visible layers of heat. At times it stopped whole half-days on sidings or by water tanks, and the engineer and fireman came back to the caboose and played poker with the conductor and train crew. The dentist sat apart behind the stove, smoking pipe after pipe of cheap tobacco. Sometimes he joined in the poker games. He had learned poker when a boy at the mine, and after a few deals, his knowledge returned to him. But for the most part he was taciturn and unsociable, and rarely spoke to the others unless spoken to first. The crew recognized the type, and the impression gained ground among them that he had done for a livery stable keeper at Truckee and was trying to get down into Arizona. Mcteague heard 2 brakemen discussing him one night as they stood outside by the halted train. "The livery stable keeper called him a bastard. That's what Picachos told me," one of them remarked, and started to draw his gun, and this fellow did for him with a hay fork. "He's a horse doctor, this chap is, and the livery stable keeper had got the law on him, so's he couldn't practice any more, and he was sore about it." Near a place called Queens, the train re-entered California, and Mcteague observed with relief that the line of track which had hitherto held westward curved sharply to the south again. The train was unmolested. Occasionally the crew fought with a gang of tramps who attempted to ride the brake beams, and once in the northern part of Inyo County, while they were halted at a water tank, an immense Indian buck blanketed to the ground, approached Mcteague as he stood on the roadbed stretching his legs, and without a word presented to him a filthy, crumpled letter. The letter was to the effect that the buck Big Jim was a good Indian and deserving of charity. The signature was illegible. The dentist stared at the letter, returned it to the buck, and regained the train just as it started. Neither had spoken. The buck did not move from his position. And fully 5 minutes afterward, when the slow-moving freight was miles away, the dentist looked back and saw him still standing motionless between the rails, a forlorn and solitary point of red, lost in the immensity of the surrounding white blur of the desert. At length the mountains began again, rising up on either side of the track, vast, naked hills of white sand and red rock, spotted with blue shadows. Here and there a patch of green was spread like a gay tablecloth over the sand. All at once Mount Whitney leaped over the horizon. Independence was reached and passed. The freight, nearly emptied by now and much shortened, rolled along the shores of Owen Lake. At a place called Keeler it stopped definitely. It was the terminus of the road. The town of Keeler was a one-street town, not unlike Iowa Hill, the post office, the bar and hotel, the Oddfellows Hall, and the livery stable being the principal buildings. "Where to now?" muttered Mcteague to himself as he sat on the edge of the bed in his room in the hotel. He hung the canary in the window, filled its little bathtub, and watched it take its bath with enormous satisfaction. "Where to now?" he muttered again. "This is as far as the railroad goes, and it wouldn't do for me to stay in a town yet a while. No, it wouldn't do. I got to clear out." "Where to?" That's the word, where to. "I'll go down to supper now," he went on, whispering his thoughts aloud so that they would take more concrete shape in his mind. "I'll go down to supper now, and then I'll hang around the bar this evening till I get the lay of this land. Maybe this is fruit country, though it looks more like a cattle country. Maybe it's a mining country. If it's a mining country," he continued, puckering his heavy eyebrows, "if it's a mining country and the mines are far enough off the roads, maybe I'd better get to the mines and lay quiet for a month before I try to get any farther south." He washed the cinders and dust of a week's railroading from his face and hair, put on a fresh pair of boots, and went down to supper. The dining room was of the invariable type of the smaller interior towns of California. There was but one table covered with oilcloth. Rows of benches answered for chairs, a railroad map, a chroma with a gilt frame protected by mosquito netting, hung on the walls, together with a yellowed photograph of the proprietor in Masonic regalia. 2. Waitresses, whom the guests all men called by their first names, came and went with large trays. Through the windows outside, Mcteague observed a great number of saddle horses tied to trees and fences. Each one of these horses had a riata on the pommel of the saddle. He sat down to the table, eating his thick hot soup, watching his neighbors covertly, listening to everything that was said. It did not take him long to gather that the country to the east and south of Keeler was a cattle country. Not far off, across a range of hills, was the Panamint Valley, where the big cattle ranges were. Every now and then this name was tossed to and fro across the table in the flow of conversation. "Over in the Panamint. Just going down for a rodeo in the Panamint. Panamint brands. Has a range down in the Panamint." Then by and by the remark, "Oh yes, Gold Gulch they're down to. Good pay there. That's on the other side of the Panamint Range. Peters came in yesterday and told me." Mcteague turned to the speaker. "Is that a gravel mine?" he asked. "No, no, Quartz. I'm a miner. That's why I asked." "Well, I've mined some too. I had a hole in the ground myself, but she was silver. And when the skunks at Washington lowered the price of silver, where was I? Fitchard, b'God, I was looking for a job. Well, it's mostly cattle down here in the Panamint, but since the strike over it, Gold Gulch, some of the boys have gone prospecting. There's gold in them, damn Panamint mountains. If you can find a good long contact of country rocks, you ain't far from it. There's a couple of fellers from Redlands has located 4 claims around Gold Gulch. They got a vein 18 inches wide, and Peter says you can trace it for more'n 1,000 feet. Were you thinking of prospecting over there?" Well, I don't know. Well, I'm going over to the other side of the range day after tomorrow, after some ponies of mine. and I'm going to have a look around. You say you've been a miner? Yes, yes. If you're going over that way, you might come along and see if we can't find contact or copper sulfurates or something. Even if we don't find color, we may find silver-bearing galena. Then, after a pause, let's see, I didn't catch your name. Huh, my name's Carter, answered Mcteague promptly. Why he should change his name again the dentist could not say. Carter came to his mind at once, and he answered without reflecting that he had registered as Burlington when he had arrived at the hotel. Well, my name's Cribbins, answered the other. The two shook hands solemnly. You're about finished, continued Cribbins, pushing back. Please go out in the bar and have a drink on it. Sure, sure, said the dentist. The two sat up late that night in a corner of the barroom discussing the probability of finding gold in the Panamint Hills. It soon became evident that they held differing theories. Mcteague clung to the old prospector's idea that there was no way of telling where gold was until you actually saw it. Cribbins had evidently read a good many books upon the subject, and had already prospected in something of a scientific manner. Shucks, he exclaimed. Gee me a long distinct contact between sedimentary and igneous rocks, and I'll sink a shaft without ever seeing color. The dentist put his huge chin in the air. Gold is where you find it, he returned doggedly. Well, it's my idea as how pardners ought to work along different lines, said Cribbins. He tucked the corners of his mustache into his mouth and sucked the tobacco juice from them. For a moment he was thoughtful, then he blew out his mustache abruptly and exclaimed, Say, Carter, least make a go of this. You got a little cash. I suppose $50 or so? Huh. Yes, I got about 50. We'll go pardners on the proposition, and we'll dally round the range yonder and see what we can see. What do you say? Sure, answered the dentist. Well, it's a go then, hey? That's the word. Well, le's have a drink on it. They drank with profound gravity. They fitted out the next day at the general merchandise store of keeler picks, shovels, prospectors' hammers, a couple of cradles, pans, bacon, flour, coffee, and the like, and they bought a burro on which to pack their kit. Say, by jingo, you ain't got a horse, suddenly exclaimed Cribbins as they came out of the store. You can't get around this country without a pony of some kind. Cribbins already owned and rode a buckskin cayuse that had to be knocked in the head and stunned before it could be saddled. I got an extra saddle and a headstall at the hotel that you can use, he said, but you'll have to get a horse. In the end, the dentist bought a mule at the livery stable for $40. It turned out to be a good bargain, however, for the mule was a good traveler and seemed actually to fatten on sagebrush and potato parings. When the actual transaction took place, Mcteague had been obliged to get the money to pay for the mule out of the canvas sack. Cribbins was with him at the time, and as the dentist unrolled his blankets and disclosed the sack, whistled in amazement. And me asking you if you had $50, he exclaimed. You carry your mine right around with you, don't you? Huh, I guess so, muttered the dentist. I just sold a claim I had up in El Dorado County, he added. At 5 o'clock on a magnificent May morning, the parders jogged out of Keeler, driving the burro before them. Cribbins rode his cayuse, Mcteague following in his rear on the mule. Say, remarked Cribbins, why in thunder don't you leave that fool canary behind at the hotel? It's going to be in your way all the time, and it will sure die. Better break its neck and chuck it. No, insisted the dentist. I've had it too long. I'll take it with me. Well, that's the craziest idea I ever heard of, remarked Cribbins. To take a canary along prospecting, why not kid gloves and be done with it? They traveled leisurely to the southeast during the day, following a well-beaten cattle road, and that evening camped on a spur of some hills at the head of the Panamint Valley where there was a spring. The next day they crossed the Panamint itself. That's a smart-looking valley, observed the dentist. Now you're talking straight talk, returned Cribbins, sucking his mustache. The valley was beautiful, wide, level, and very green. Everywhere were herds of cattle, scarcely less wild than deer. Once or twice cowboys passed them on the road, big-boned fellows, picturesque in their broad hats, hairy trousers, jingling spurs, and revolver belts, surprisingly like the pictures Mcteague remembered to have seen. Every one of them knew Cribbins and almost invariably joshed him on his venture. "Say, Crib, ye'd best take a wagon train with ye to bring your dust back." Cribbins resented their humor, and after they had passed, chewed fiercely on his mustache. "I'd like to make a strike, b'God, if it was only to get the laugh on them joshers." By noon they were climbing the eastern slope of the Panamint Range. Long since they had abandoned the road. Vegetation ceased. Not a tree was in sight. They followed faint cattle trails that led from one waterhole to another. By degrees these waterholes grew drier and drier, and at 3 o'clock Cribbins halted and filled their canteens. "There ain't any too much water on the other side," he observed grimly. "It's pretty hot," muttered the dentist, wiping his streaming forehead with the back of his hand. "Huh!" snorted the other more grimly than ever. The motionless air was like the mouth of a furnace. Cribbins's pony lathered and panted. Mcteague's mule began to droop his long ears. Only the little burro plodded resolutely on, picking the trail where Mcteague could see but trackless sand and stunted sage. Towards evening Cribbins, who was in the lead, drew rein on the summit of the hills. Behind them was the beautiful green Panamint Valley, but before and below them for miles and miles, as far as the eye could reach, a flat white desert, empty even of sagebrush, unrolled toward the horizon. In the immediate foreground a broken system of arroyos and little cañons tumbled down to meet it. To the north faint blue hills shouldered themselves above the horizon. "Well," observed Cribbins, "we're on the top of the Panamint Range now. It's along this eastern slope, right below us here, that we're going to prospect. Gold Gulch," he pointed with the butt of his quirt, "is about 18 or 19 miles along here to the north of us. Those hills way over yonder to the northeast are the Telescope Hills. What do you call the desert out yonder?" Mcteague's eyes wandered over the illimitable stretch of alkali that stretched out forever and forever to the east, to the north, and to the south. "That," said Cribbins, "that's Death Valley." There was a long pause. The horses panted irregularly, the sweat dripping from their heaving bellies. Cribbins and the dentist sat motionless in their saddles, looking out over that abominable desolation, silent, troubled. "God!" ejaculated Cribbins at length, under his breath, with a shake of his head. Then he seemed to rouse himself. "Well," he remarked, "first thing we gotta do now is to find water." This was a long and difficult task. They descended into one little cañon after another, followed the course of numberless arroyos, and even dug where there seemed indications of moisture, all to no purpose. But at length Mcteague's mule put his nose in the air and blew once or twice through his nostrils. "Smells it, the son of a gun!" exclaimed Cribbins. The dentist let the animal have his head, and in a few minutes he had brought them to the bed of a tiny cañon where a thin stream of brackish water filtered over a ledge of rocks. "We'll camp here," observed Cribbins, "but we can't turn the horses loose. We'll have to picket 'em with the lariats. I saw some loco weed back here a piece, and if they get to eating that, they'll sure go plumb crazy. The burro won't eat it, but I wouldn't trust the others." A new life began for Mcteague. After breakfast the parters separated, going in opposite directions along the slope of the range, examining rocks, picking and chipping at ledges and boulders, looking for signs, prospecting. Mcteague went up into the little cañons where the streams had cut through the bedrock, searching for veins of quartz, breaking out this quartz when he had found it, pulverizing and panning it. Cribbins hunted for contacts, closely examining country rocks and outcrops, continually on the lookout for spots where sedimentary and igneous rock came together. One day, after a week of prospecting, they met unexpectedly on the slope of an arroyo. It was late in the afternoon. "Hello, partner," exclaimed Cribbins as he came down to where Mcteague was bending over his pan. "What luck?" The dentist emptied his pan and straightened up. "Nothing, nothing. You struck anything?" "Not a trace. Guess we might as well be moving towards camp." They returned together, Cribbins telling the dentist of a group of antelope he had seen. "We might lay off tomorrow and see if we can plug a couple of them fellers. Antelope steak will go pretty well after beans and bacon and coffee week in and week out." Mcteague was answering when Cribbins interrupted him with an exclamation of profound disgust. "I thought we were the first to prospect along in here, and now, look at that. Don't it make you sick?" He pointed out evidences of an abandoned prospector's camp just before them: charred ashes, empty tin cans, 1 or 2 gold miners' pans, and a broken pick. "Don't that make you sick?" muttered Cribbins, sucking his mustache furiously. "To think of us mush-heads going over ground that's been covered already. Say, pardner, we'll dig out of here tomorrow. I've been thinking, anyhow, we'd better move to the south. That water of ours is pretty low." Yes, I guess so," assented the dentist. "There ain't any gold here." "Yes, there is," protested Cribbins doggedly. "There's gold all through these hills if we could only strike it. I tell you what, pardner, I got a place in mind where I'll bet no one ain't prospected least. Not very many. There don't very many care to try and get to it. It's over on the other side of Death Valley. It's called Gold Mountain, and there's only one mine been located there, and it's paying like a nitrate bed. There ain't many people in that country. Because it's all hell to get into. First place, you got to cross Death Valley and strike the Armagosa Range fur off to the south. Well, no one ain't stuck on crossing the valley, not if they can help it. But we could work down the Panamint some 100 or so miles, maybe 200, and fetch around by the Armagosa River, way to the south of Jerd. We could prospect on the way, but I guess the Armagosa'd be dried up at this season. Anyhow," he concluded, "we'll move camp to the south tomorrow. We got to get new feed and water for the horses. We'll see if we can knock over a couple of antelope tomorrow, and then we'll scoot." "I ain't got a gun," said the dentist. "Not even a revolver." Wait a second," said Cribbins, pausing in his scramble down the side of one of the smaller gulches. "Here's some slate here. I ain't seen no slate around here yet. Let's see where it goes to." Mcteague followed him along the side of the gulch. Cribbins went on ahead, muttering to himself from time to time. "Runs right along here, even enough, and here's water too. Didn't know this stream was here. Pretty near dry though. Here's the slate again. See where it runs, pardner?" "Look at it up there ahead," said Mcteague. "It runs right up over the back of this hill." "That's right," assented Cribbins. "Hi!" he shouted suddenly. "Here's a consect, and here it is again, and there, and yonder. Oh, look at it, will you? That's granadorit on slate. Couldn't want it any more distinct than that. Gowd, if we could only find the quartz between the two now." "Well, there it is," exclaimed Mcteague. "Look on ahead there. Ain't that quartz?" "You're shouting right out loud," vociferated Cribbins, looking where Mcteague was pointing. His face went suddenly pale. He turned to the dentist, his eyes wide. "By God, pardner," he exclaimed breathlessly. "By God," he broke off abruptly. "That's what you been looking for, ain't it?" asked the dentist. Looking for? Cribbins checked himself. "That's slate all right, and that's granodiorite, I know." He bent down and examined the rock, and here's the quartz between 'em. There can't be no mistake about that. "Geez me, that hammer!" he cried excitedly. "Come on, get to work, jab into the quartz with your pick, get out some chunks of it." Cribbins went down on his hands and knees, attacking the quartz vein furiously. The dentist followed his example, swinging his pick with enormous force, splintering the rocks at every stroke. Cribbins was talking to himself in his excitement. "Got you this time, you son of a gun, by God!" I guess we got you this time at last. Looks like it, anyhow. Get a move on, pardner. There ain't anybody round, is there? Hey." Without looking, he drew his revolver and threw it to the dentist. "Take the gun and look around, pardner. If you see any son of a gun anywhere, plug him. This year's your claim. I guess we got it this time, partner. Come on." He gathered up the chunks of quartz he had broken out and put them in his hat and started towards their camp. The two went along with great strides, hurrying as fast as they could over the uneven ground. "I don't know," exclaimed Cribbins breathlessly. "I don't want to say too much. Maybe we're fooled. Lord, that damn camp's a long ways off. Oh, I ain't going to fool along this way. Come on, pardner." He broke into a run. Mcteague followed at a lumbering gallop. Over the scorched, parched ground, stumbling and tripping over sagebrush and sharp-pointed rocks, under the palpitating heat of the desert sun, they ran and scrambled, carrying the quartz lumps in their hats. "See any color in it, pardner?" gasped Cribbins. "I can't, can you? 'Twouldn't be visible nohow, I guess. Hurry up. Lord, we ain't ever going to get to that camp." Finally they arrived. Cribbins dumped the quartz fragments into a pan. "You pestle her, pardner, and I'll fix the scales." Mcteague ground the lumps to fine dust in the iron mortar while Cribbins set up the tiny scales and got out the spoons from their outfit. "That's fine enough," Cribbins exclaimed impatiently. "Now we'll spoon her." Gebbins exclaimed impatiently. "Now we'll spoon her. Gauge me the water." Cribbins scooped up a spoonful of the fine white powder and began to spoon it carefully. The two were on their hands and knees upon the ground, their heads close together, still panting with excitement and the exertion of their run. "Can't do it," exclaimed Cribbins, sitting back on his heels. "Handshake so. You take it, pardner. Careful, now." Mcteague took the horn spoon and began rocking it gently in his huge fingers, sluicing the water over the edge a little at a time, each movement washing away a little more of the powdered quartz. The two watched it with the intensest eagerness. "Don't see it yet. Don't see it yet," whispered Cribbins, chewing his mustache. "Let lee faster, pardner. That's the ticket. Careful, steady now. Let lee more. Let lee more. Don't see color yet, do you?" The quartz sediment dwindled by degrees as Mcteague spooned it steadily. Then at last a thin streak of a foreign substance began to show just along the edge. It was yellow. Neither spoke. Cribbins dug his nails into the sand and ground his mustache between his teeth. The yellow streak broadened as the quartz sediment washed away. Cribbins whispered, "We got it, pardner. That's gold." Mcteague washed the last of the white quartz dust away and let the water trickle after it. A pinch of gold, fine as flour, was left in the bottom of the spoon. "There you are," he said. The two looked at each other. Then Cribbins rose into the air with a great leap and a yell that could have been heard for half a mile. "Yee-ow! We got it! We struck it! Pardner, we got it! Out of sight! We're millionaires!" He snatched up his revolver and fired it with inconceivable rapidity. "Put it there, old man," he shouted, gripping Mcteague's palm. "That's gold, all right," muttered Mcteague, studying the contents of the spoon. "You bet your great-grandma's Cochin China Chessy cat it's gold," shouted Cribbins. "Here, now, we got a lot to do. We got to stake her out and put up the location notice. We'll take our full acreage, you bet. We haven't weighed this yet. Where's the scales?" He weighed the pinch of gold with shaking hands. 2 grains, he cried. "That'll run $5 to the ton. Rich, it's the richest kind of pay, pardner. We're millionaires. Why don't you say something? Why don't you get excited? Why don't you run around and do something?" "Huh," said Mcteague, rolling his eyes. "Huh, I know. We've struck it pretty rich." "Come on," exclaimed Cribbins, jumping up again. "We'll stake her out and put up the location notice. Lord, suppose anyone should have come on her while we've been away." He reloaded his revolver deliberately. "We'll drop him all." "Right. if there's anyone fooling round there. I'll tell you those right now. Bring the rifle, partner, and if you see anyone, plug him and ask him what he wants afterward." They hurried back to where they had made their discovery. "To think," exclaimed Cribbins as he drove the first stake, "to think those other mushheads had their camp within gunshot of her and never located her. Guess they didn't know the meaning of a contact." Oh, I knew I was solid on contacts. They staked out their claim, and Cribbins put up the notice of location. It was dark before they were through. Cribbins broke off some more chunks of quartz in the vein. "I'll spoon this too, just for the fun of it, when I get home," he explained as they tramped back to the camp. "Well," said the dentist, "we got the laugh on those cowboys." "Have we?" shouted Cribbins. "Had me! Just wait and see the rush for this place when we tell 'em about it down in Keeler. Say, what'll we call her? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. We might call her the Last Chance. 'Twas our last chance, wasn't it? We'd gone antelope shooting tomorrow, and the next day we'd say, 'What you stopping for?'" he added, interrupting himself. "What's up?" The dentist had paused abruptly on the crest of a cañon. Cribbins, looking back, saw him standing motionless in his tracks. "What's up?" asked Cribbins a second time. Mcteague slowly turned his head and looked over one shoulder, then over the other. Suddenly he wheeled sharply about, cocking the Winchester and tossing it to his shoulder. Cribbins ran back to his side, whipping out his revolver. "What is it?" he cried. "See anybody?" He peered on ahead through the gathering twilight. "No, no. Hear anything? No, didn't hear anything." "What is it then? What's up?" "I don't know. I don't know," muttered the dentist, lowering the rifle. There was something. "What? Something didn't you notice?" "What?" "I don't know. Something, something or other." "Who? What? Notice what? What did you see?" The dentist let down the hammer of the rifle. "I guess it wasn't anything," he said rather foolishly. "What you think you saw anybody on the claim?" "I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything either. I had an idea, that's all. Calm all of a sudden, like that. Something, I don't know what." "I guess you just imagined something. There ain't anybody within 20 miles of us, I guess." "Yes, I guess so. Just imagined it, that's the word." Half an hour later they had the fire going. Mcteague was frying strips of bacon over the coals, and Cribbins was still chattering and exclaiming over their great strike. All at once Mcteague put down the frying pan. "What's that?" he growled. "Hey? What's what?" exclaimed Cribbins, getting up. "Didn't you notice something? Where?" "Off there." The dentist made a vague gesture toward the eastern horizon. "Didn't you hear something? I mean, see something? I mean, what's the matter with you, partner?" "Nothing. I guess I just imagined it." But it was not imagination. Until midnight the partners lay broad awake, rolled in their blankets under the open sky, talking and discussing and making plans. At last Cribbins rolled over on his side and slept. The dentist could not sleep. What? It was warning him again, that strange sixth sense, that obscure brute instinct. It was aroused again and clamoring to be obeyed. Here, in these desolate barren hills, 20 miles from the nearest human being, it stirred and woke and Rowelled him to be moving on. It had goaded him to flight from the Big Dipper mine, and he had obeyed. But now it was different. Now he had suddenly become rich. He had lighted on a treasure far more valuable than the Big Dipper mine itself. How was he to leave that? He could not move on now. He turned about in his blankets. No, he would not move on. Perhaps it was his fancy, after all. He saw nothing, heard nothing. The emptiness of primeval desolation stretched from him leagues and leagues upon either hand. The gigantic silence of the night lay close over everything, like a muffling titanic palm. Of what was he suspicious? In that treeless waste an object could be seen at half a day's journey distant. In that vast silence, the click of a pebble was as audible as a pistol shot. And yet there was nothing, nothing. The dentist settled himself in his blankets and tried to sleep. In 5 minutes he was sitting up, staring into the blue-gray shimmer of the moonlight, straining his ears, watching and listening intently. Nothing was in sight. The browned and broken flanks of the Panamint Hills lay quiet and familiar under the moon. The burro moved its head with a clinking of its bell, and Mcteague's mule, dozing on 3 legs, changed its weight to another foot with a long breath. Everything fell. Silent again. "What is it?" muttered the dentist. "If I could only see something, hear something." He threw off the blankets and, rising, climbed to the summit of the nearest hill and looked back in the direction in which he and Cribbins had traveled a fortnight before. For half an hour he waited, watching and listening in vain. But as he returned to camp and prepared to roll his blankets about him, the strange impulse rose in him again abruptly, never so strong, never so insistent. It seemed as though he were bitted and ridden, as if some unseen hand were turning him toward the east, some unseen heel spurring him to precipitate an instant flight. Flight from what? "No," he muttered under his breath. "Go now and leave the claim and leave a fortune. What a fool I'd be, when I can't see anything or hear anything. To leave a fortune. No, I won't. No, by God." He drew Cribbins's Winchester toward him and slipped the cartridge into the magazine. "No," he growled. "Whatever happens, I'm going to stay. If anybody comes—" He depressed the lever of the rifle and sent the cartridge clashing into the breech. "I ain't going to sleep," he muttered under his mustache. "I can't sleep. I'll watch." He rose a second time, clambered to the nearest hilltop and sat down, drawing the blanket around him and laying the Winchester across his knees. The hours passed. The dentist sat on the hilltop a motionless, crouching figure, inky black against the pale blur of the sky. By and by the edge of the eastern horizon began to grow blacker and more distinct in outline. The dawn was coming. Once more Mcteague felt the mysterious intuition of approaching danger. An unseen hand seemed reining his head eastward. A spur was in his flanks that seemed to urge him to hurry, hurry, hurry. The influence grew stronger with every moment. The dentist set his great jaws together and held his ground. "No," he growled between his set teeth. "No, I'll stay." He made a long circuit around the camp, even going as far as the first stake of the new claim, his Winchester cocked, his ears pricked, his eyes alert. There was nothing, yet as plainly as though it were shouted at the very nape of his neck, he felt an enemy. It was not fear. Mcteague was not afraid. "If I could only see something, somebody," he muttered, as he held the cocked rifle ready, "I'd show him." He returned to camp. Cribbins was snoring. The burro had come down to the stream for its morning drink. The mule was awake and browsing. Mcteague stood irresolutely by the cold ashes of the camp fire, looking from side to side with all the suspicion and wariness of a tracked stag. Stronger and stronger grew the strange impulse. It seemed to him that on the next instant he must perforce wheels sharply eastward and rush away headlong in a clumsy, lumbering gallop. He fought against it with all the ferocious obstinacy of his simple brute nature. Go and leave the mine? Go and leave $1 million? No, no, I won't go. No, I won't stay. "Ah," he exclaimed under his breath with a shake of his huge head like an exasperated and harassed brute. "Ah, show yourself, will you?" He brought the rifle to his shoulder and covered point after point along the range of hills to the west. "Come on, show yourself. Come on a little, all of you. I ain't afraid of you. But don't skulk this way. You ain't going to drive me away from my mine. I'm going to stay." An hour passed, then 2. The stars winked out and the dawn whitened. The air became warmer. The whole east, clean of clouds, flamed opalescent from horizon to zenith, crimson at the base where the earth blackened against it, at the top fading from pink to pale yellow to green to light blue to the turquoise. Iridescence of the desert sky, the long thin shadows of the early hours drew backward like receding serpents. Then suddenly the sun looked over the shoulder of the world, and it was day. At that moment Mcteague was already 8 miles away from the camp, going steadily eastward. He was descending the lowest spurs of the Panamint Hills, following an old and faint cattle trail. Before him he drove his mule laden with blankets, provisions for 6 days, Cribben's rifle and a canteen full of water. Securely bound to the pommel of the saddle was the canvas sack with its precious $5,000, all in $20 gold pieces. But strange enough, in that horrid waste of sand and sage was the object that Mcteague himself persistently carried, the canary in its cage, about which he had carefully wrapped a couple of old flour bags. At about 5 o'clock that morning, Mcteague had crossed several trails which seemed to be converging, and, guessing that they led to a waterhole, had followed one of them and had brought up at a sort of small sun-dried sink, which nevertheless contained a little water at the bottom. He had watered the mule here, refilled the canteen, and drank deep himself. He had also dampened the old flour sacks around the bird cage to protect the little canary as far as possible from the heat that he knew would increase now with every hour. He had made ready to go forward again, but had paused irresolute again, hesitating for the last time. "I'm a fool," he growled, scowling back at the range behind him. "I'm a fool. What's the matter with me? I'm just walking right away from $1 million. I know it's there." "No, by God," he exclaimed savagely. "I ain't going to do it. I'm going back. I can't leave a mine like that." He had wheeled the mule about and had started to return on his tracks, grinding his teeth fiercely, inclining his head forward as though butting against a wind that would beat him back. Go on," he cried, sometimes addressing the mule, sometimes himself. "Go on, go." "Back, go back. I will go back." It was as though he were climbing a hill that grew steeper with every stride. The strange impelling instinct fought his advance yard by yard. By degrees the dentist's steps grew slower. He stopped, went forward again cautiously, almost feeling his way, like someone approaching a pit in the darkness. He stopped again, hesitating, gnashing his teeth, clenching his fists with blind fury. Suddenly he turned the mule about and once more set his face to the eastward. "I can't," he cried aloud to the desert. I can't. It's stronger than I am. I can't go back. Hurry now, hurry." He hastened on furtively, his head and shoulders bent. At times one could almost say he crouched as he pushed forward with long strides. Now and then he even looked over his shoulder. Sweat rolled from him, he lost his hat, and the matted mane of thick yellow hair swept over his forehead and shaded his small, twinkling eyes. At times, with a vague, nearly automatic gesture, he reached his hand forward, the fingers prehensile, and directed towards the horizon, as if he would clutch it and draw it nearer. And at intervals he muttered, "Hurry, hurry, hurry on, hurry on." For now at last Mcteague was afraid. His plans were uncertain. He remembered what Cribbens had said about the Armagosa Mountains in the country on the other side of Death Valley. It was all hell to get into that country, Cribbens had said, and not many men went there because of the terrible valley of alkali that barred the way, a horrible vast sink of white sand and salt below even the sea level, the dry bed, no doubt, of some prehistoric lake. But Mcteague resolved to make a circuit of the valley, keeping to the south until he should strike the Armagosa River. He would make a circuit of the valley and come up on the other side. He would get into that country around Gold Mountain, in the Armagosa Hills, barred off from the world by the leagues of the red-hot alkali of Death Valley. They would hardly reach him. There, he would stay at Gold Mountain 2 or 3 months and then work his way down into Mexico. Mcteague tramped steadily forward, still descending the lower irregularities of the Panamint Range. By 9 o'clock the slope flattened out abruptly. The hills were behind him. Before him, to the east, all was level. He had reached the region where even the sand and sagebrush began to dwindle, giving place to white powdered alkali. The trails were numerous, but old and faint, and they had been made by cattle, not by men. They led in all directions, but one north, south, and west. But not one, however faint, struck out towards the valley. "If I keep along the edge of the hills where these trails are," muttered the dentist, "I ought to find water up in the arroyos from time to time." At once he uttered an exclamation. The mule had begun to squeal and lash out with alternate hoofs, his eyes rolling, his ears flattened. He ran a few steps, halted, and squealed again. Then, suddenly wheeling at right angles, set off on a jog trot to the north, squealing and kicking from time to time. Mcteague ran after him shouting and swearing, but for a long time the mule would not allow himself to be caught. He seemed more bewildered than frightened. "He's eaten some of that loco weed that Cribbins spoke about," panted Mcteague. "Whoa, there! Steady, you!" At length the mule stopped of his own accord, and seemed to come to his senses again. Mcteague came up and took the bridle rein, speaking to him and rubbing his nose. "There, there, what's the matter with you?" The mule was docile again. Mcteague washed his mouth and set forward once more. The day was magnificent. From horizon to horizon was one vast span of blue, whitening as it dipped earthward. Miles upon miles to the east and southeast the desert unrolled itself, white, naked, inhospitable, palpitating and shimmering. Under the sun, unbroken by so much as a rock or cactus stump. In the distance it assumed all manner of faint colors, pink, purple, and pale orange. To the west rose the Panamint Range, sparsely sprinkled with gray sagebrush. Here the earths and sands were yellow, ochre, and rich deep red. The hollows and canyons picked out with intense blue shadows. It seemed strange that such barrenness could exhibit this radiance of color, but nothing could have been more beautiful than the deep red of the higher bluffs and ridges, seamed with purple shadows, standing sharply out against the pale blue whiteness of the horizon. By 9 o'clock the sun stood high in the sky. The heat was intense. The atmosphere was thick and heavy with it. Mcteague gasped for breath and wiped the beads of perspiration from his forehead, his cheeks, and his neck. Every inch and pore of his skin was tingling and pricking under the merciless lash of the sun's rays. "If it gets much hotter," he muttered with a long breath, "if it gets much hotter, I don't know." He wagged his head and wiped the sweat from his eyelids, where it was running like tears. The sun rose higher, hour by hour, as the dentist tramped steadily on. The heat increased. The baked dry sand crackled into innumerable tiny flakes under his feet. The twigs of the sagebrush snapped like brittle pipe stems as he pushed through them. It grew hotter. At 11 the earth was like the surface of a furnace. The air, as Mcteague breathed it in, was hot to his lips and the roof of his mouth. The sun was a disk of molten brass swimming in the burnt-out blue of the sky. Mcteague stripped off his woolen shirt and even unbuttoned his flannel undershirt, tying a handkerchief loosely about his neck. "Lord," he exclaimed, "I never knew it could get as hot as this." The heat grew steadily fiercer. All distant objects were visibly shimmering and palpitating under it. At noon, a mirage appeared on the hills to the northwest. Mcteague halted the mule and drank from the tepid water in the canteen, dampening the sack around the canary's cage. As soon as he ceased his tramp and the noise of his crunching, grinding footsteps died away, the silence, vast, illimitable, enfolded him like an immeasurable tide. From all that gigantic landscape, that colossal reach of baking sand, there arose not a single sound. Not a twig rattled, not an insect hummed, not a bird or beast invaded that huge solitude with call or cry. Everything as far as the eye could reach, to north, to south, to east and west, lay inert, absolutely quiet and moveless under the remorseless scourge of the noon sun. The very shadows shrank away, hiding under sage bushes, retreating to the farthest nooks and crevices in the cañons of the hills. All the world was one gigantic blinding glare, silent, motionless. "If it gets much hotter," murmured the dentist again, moving his head from side to side. "If it gets much hotter, I don't know what I'll do." Steadily the heat increased. At 3 o'clock, it was even more terrible than it had been at noon. "Ain't it ever going to let up?" groaned the dentist, rolling his eyes at the sky of hot blue brass. Then, as he spoke, the stillness was abruptly stabbed through and through by a shrill sound that seemed to come from all sides at once. It ceased, then, as Mcteague took another forward step, began again with the suddenness of a blow, shriller, nearer at hand, a hideous, prolonged note that brought both man and mule to an instant halt. "I know what that is," exclaimed the dentist. His eyes searched the ground swiftly until he saw what he expected he should see: the round thick coil, the slowly waving clover-shaped head and erect whirring tail with its vibrant rattles. For fully 30 seconds the man and snake remained looking into each other's eyes. Then the snake uncoiled and swiftly wound from sight amidst the sagebrush. Mcteague drew breath again, and his eyes once more beheld the illimitable leagues of quivering sand and alkali. "Good Lord, what a country!" he exclaimed. But his voice was trembling as he urged forward the mule once more. Fiercer and fiercer grew the heat as the afternoon advanced. At 4 Mcteague stopped again. He was dripping at every pore, but there was no relief in perspiration. The very touch of his clothes upon his body was unendurable. The mule's ears were drooping, and his tongue lolled from his mouth. The cattle trails seemed to be drawing together toward a common point. Perhaps a waterhole was nearby. "I'll have to lay up sure," muttered the dentist. "I ain't made to travel in such heat as this." He drove the mule up into one of the larger cañons and halted in the shadow of a pile of red rock. After a long search he found water, a few quarts, warm and brackish, at the bottom of a hollow of sun-racked mud. It was little more than enough to water the mule and refill his canteen. Here he camped, easing the mule of the saddle and turning him loose to find what nourishment he might. A few hours later, the sun set in a cloudless glory of red and gold, and the heat became by degrees less intolerable. Mcteague cooked his supper, chiefly coffee and bacon, and watched the twilight come on, reveling in the delicious coolness of the evening. As he spread his blankets on the ground, he resolved that hereafter he would travel only at night, laying up in the daytime in the shade of the cañons. He was exhausted with his terrible day's march. Never in his life had sleep seemed so sweet to him, but suddenly he was broad awake, his jaded senses all alert. "What was dat?" he muttered. "I thought I heard something, saw something." He rose to his feet, reaching for the Winchester. Desolation lay still around him. There was not a sound but his own breathing. On the face of the desert not a grain of sand was in motion. Mcteague looked furtively and quickly from side to side, his teeth set, his eyes rolling. Once more the row was in his flanks. Once more an unseen hand reined him toward the east. After all the miles of that dreadful day's flight, he was no better off than when he started. If anything, he was worse, for never had that mysterious instinct in him been more insistent than now. Never had the impulse toward precipitate flight been stronger. Never had the spur bit deeper. Every nerve of his body cried aloud for rest, yet every instinct seemed aroused and alive, goading him to hurry on, to hurry on. "What is it then? What is it?" he cried between his teeth. "Can't I ever get rid of you? Ain't I ever going to shake you off? Don't keep it up this way? Sho!" "You're themselves. Let's have it out right away. Come on. I ain't afraid if you'll only come on, but don't skulk this way." Suddenly he cried aloud in a frenzy of exasperation, "Damn you, come on, will you? Come on and have it out!" His rival was at his shoulder. He was covering bush after bush, rock after rock, aiming at every denser shadow. All at once, and quite involuntarily, his forefinger crooked, and the rifle spoke and flamed. The cañas roared back the echo, tossing it out far over the desert in a rippling, widening wave of sound. Mcteague lowered the rifle hastily with an exclamation of dismay. "You fool," he said to himself, "you fool. You've done it now. They could hear that miles away. You've done it now. They could hear that miles away. You've done it now." He stood listening intently, the rifle smoking in his hands. The last echo died away. The smoke vanished. The vast silence closed upon the passing echoes of the rifle as the ocean closes upon a ship's wake. Nothing moved, yet Mcteague bestirred himself sharply, rolling up his blankets, resaddling the mule, getting his outfit together again. From time to time he muttered, "Hurry now, hurry on, you fool, you've done it now. They could hear that miles away. Hurry now, they ain't far off now." As he depressed the lever of the rifle to reload it, he found that the magazine was empty. He clapped his hands to his sides, feeling rapidly first in one pocket, then in another. He had forgotten to take extra cartridges with him. Mcteague swore under his breath as he flung the rifle away. Henceforth he must travel unarmed. A little more water had gathered in the mud hole near which he had camped. He watered the mule for the last time and wet the sacks around the canary's cage. Then once more he set forward. But there was a change in the direction of Mcteague's flight. Hitherto he had held to the south, keeping upon the very edge of the hills. Now he turned sharply at right angles. The slope fell away beneath his hurrying feet. The sagebrush dwindled and at length ceased. The sand gave place to a fine powder, white as snow. And an hour after he had fired the rifle, his mule's hoofs were crisping and cracking the sun-baked flakes of alkali on the surface of Death Valley. Tracked and harried, as he felt himself to be, from one camping place to another, Mcteague had suddenly resolved to make one last effort to rid himself of the enemy that seemed to hang upon his heels. He would strike straight out into that horrible wilderness where even the beasts were afraid. He would cross Death Valley at once and put its arid wastes between him and his pursuer. "You don't dare follow me now," he muttered as he hurried on. "Let's see you come out here after me." He hurried on swiftly, urging the mule to a rapid racking walk. Towards 4 o'clock the sky in front of him began to flush pink and golden. Mcteague halted and breakfasted, pushing on again immediately afterward. The dawn flamed and glowed like a brazier, and the sun rose a vast red-hot coal floating in fire. An hour passed, then another, and another. It was about 9 o'clock. Once more the dentist paused and stood panting and blowing, his arms dangling, his eyes screwed up and blinking as he looked about him. Far behind him the Panamid hills were already but blue hummocks on the horizon. Before him and upon either side, to the north and to the east and to the south, stretched primordial desolation. League upon league, the infinite reaches of dazzling white alkali laid themselves out like an immeasurable scroll unrolled from horizon to horizon. Not a bush, not a twig, relieved that horrible monotony. Even the sand of the desert would have been a welcome sight. A single clump of sagebrush would have fascinated the eye. But this was worse than the desert. It was abominable, this hideous sink of alkali, this bed of some primeval lake lying so far below the level of the ocean. The great mountains of Placer County had been merely indifferent to man, but this awful sink of alkali was openly and unreservedly iniquitous and malignant. Mcteague had told himself that the heat upon the lower slopes of the Panamint had been dreadful. Here in Death Valley it became a thing of terror. There was no longer any shadow but his own. He was scourged and parched from head to heel. It seemed to him that the smart of his tortured body could not have been keener if he had been flayed. "If it gets much hotter," he muttered, wringing the sweat from his thick fell of hair and mustache, "if it gets much hotter, I don't know what I'll do." He was thirsty and drank a little from his canteen. "I ain't got any too much water," he murmured, shaking the canteen. "I got to get out of this place in a hurry, sure." By 11 o'clock, the heat had increased to such an extent that Mcteague could feel the burning of the ground come pringling and stinging through the soles of his boots. Every step he took threw up clouds of impalpable alkali dust, salty and choking, so that he strangled and coughed and sneezed with it. "Lord, what a country!" exclaimed the dentist. An hour later, the mule stopped and lay down, his jaws wide open, his ears dangling. Mcteague washed his mouth with a handful of water and for a second time since sunrise wetted the flour sacks around the bird cage. The air was quivering and palpitating like that in the stokehold of a steamship. The sun, small and contracted, swam smip. The sun, small and contracted, swam molten overhead. "I can't stand it," said Mcteague at length. "I'll have to stop and make some kind of shade." The mule was crouched upon the ground, panting rapidly with half-closed eyes. The dentist removed the saddle and, unrolling his blanket, propped it up as best he could between him and the sun. As he stooped down to crawl beneath it, his palm touched the ground. He snatched it away with a cry of pain. The surface alkali was oven hot. He was obliged to scoop out a trench in it before he dared to lie down. By degrees the dentist began to doze. He had had little or no sleep the night before, and the hurry of his flight under the blazing sun had exhausted him. But his rest was broken. Between waking and sleeping, all manner of troublous images galloped through his brain. He thought he was back in the Panamint Hills again with Cribbins. They had just discovered the mine and were returning toward camp. Mcteague saw himself as another man striding along over the sand and sagebrush. At once he saw himself stop and wheel sharply about, peering back suspiciously. There was something behind him, something was following him. He looked, as it were, over the shoulder of this other Mcteague and saw down there, in the half-light of the cañon, something dark crawling upon the ground, an indistinct gray figure, man or brute, he did not know. Then he saw another, and another, then another. A score of black, crawling objects were following him, crawling from bush to bush, converging upon him. They were after him, were closing in upon him, were within touch of his hand, were at his feet, were at his feet, were at his throat. Mcteague jumped up with a shout, oversetting the blanket. There was nothing in sight. For miles around, the alkali was empty, solitary, quivering and shimmering under the pelting fire of the afternoon sun. But once more the spur bit into his body, goading him on. There was to be no rest, no going back, no pause, no stop. Hurry, hurry, hurry on. The brute that in him slept so close to the surface was alive and alert, and tugging to be gone. There was no resisting that instinct. The brute felt an enemy, scented the trackers, clamored and struggled and fought, and would not be gainsayed. "I can't go on," groaned Mcteague, his eyes sweeping the horizon behind him. "I'm beat out. I'm dog-tired. I ain't slept any for 2 nights." But for all that he roused himself again, saddled the mule, scarcely less exhausted than himself, and pushed on once more over the scorching alkali and under the blazing sun. From that time on, the fear never left him, the spur never ceased to bite, the instinct that goaded him to fight never was dumb. Hurry or halt, it was all the same. On he went, straight on, chasing the receding horizon, flagellated with heat, tortured with thirst, crouching over, looking furtively behind, and at times reaching his hand forward, the fingers prehensile, grasping, as it were, toward the horizon, that always fled before him. The sun set upon the third day of Mcteague's flight. Night came on. The stars burned slowly into the cool dark purple of the sky. The gigantic sink of white alkali glowed like snow. Mcteague, now far into the desert, held steadily on, swinging forward with great strides. His enormous strength held him doggedly to his work. Sullenly, with his huge jaws gripping stolidly together, he pushed on. At midnight he stopped. "Now," he growled, with a certain desperate defiance, as though he expected to be heard. "Now, I'm going to lay up and get some sleep. You can come or not." He cleared away the hot surface alkali, spread out his blanket, and slept until the next day's heat aroused him. His water was so low that he dared not make coffee now, and so breakfasted without it. Until 10 o'clock he tramped forward, then camped again in the shade of one of the rare rock ledges and lay up during the heat of the day. By 5 o'clock he was once more on the march. He traveled on for the greater part of that night, stopping only once towards 3 in the morning to water the mule from the canteen. Again the red-hot day burned up over the horizon. Even at 6 o'clock it was hot. "It's going to be worse than ever today," he groaned. "I wish I could find another rock to camp by. Ain't I ever going to get out of this place?" There was no change in the character of the desert. Always the same measureless leagues of white-hot alkali stretched away toward the horizon on every hand. Here and there the flat, dazzling surface of the desert broke and raised into long, low mounds, from the summit of which Mcteague could look for miles and miles over its horrible desolation. No shade was in sight. Not a rock, not a stone broke the monotony of the ground. Again and again he ascended the low unevennesses, looking and searching for a camping place, shading his eyes from the glitter of sand and sky. He tramped forward a little farther, then paused at length in a hollow between 2 breaks, resolving to make camp there. Suddenly there was a shout. "Hands up! By damn, I got the drop on you!" Mcteague looked up. It was Marcus. Chapter 22. Within a month after his departure from San Francisco, Marcus had gone in on a cattle ranch in the Panamint Valley with an Englishman, an acquaintance of Mr. Siep's. His headquarters were at a place called Modoc, at the lower extremity of the valley, about 50 miles by trail to the south of Keeler. His life was the life of a cowboy. He realized his former vision of himself, booted, sombreroed, and revolvered, passing his days in the saddle, and the better part of his nights around the poker tables in Modoc's one saloon. To his intense satisfaction, he even involved himself in a gunfight that arose over a disputed brand, with the result that 2 fingers of his left hand were shot away. News from the outside world filtered slowly into the Panamint Valley, and the telegraph had never been built beyond Keeler. At intervals, one of the local papers of Independence, the nearest large town, found its way into the cattle camps on the ranges, and occasionally one of the Sunday editions of a Sacramento journal. Weeks old, was passed from hand to hand. Marcus ceased to hear from the Seppies. As for San Francisco, it was as far from him as was London or Vienna. One day, a fortnight after Mcteague's flight from San Francisco, Marcus rode into Modoc to find a group of men gathered about a notice affixed to the outside of the Wells Fargo office. It was an offer of reward for the arrest and apprehension of a murderer. The crime had been committed in San Francisco, but the man wanted had been traced as far as the western portion of Inyo County and was believed at that time to be in hiding in either the Pinto or Panamint Hills in the vicinity of Keeler. Marcus reached Keeler on the afternoon of that same day. Half a mile from the town, his pony fell and died from exhaustion. Marcus did not stop even to remove the saddle. He arrived in the barroom of the hotel in Keeler just after the posse had been made up. The sheriff, who had come down from Independence that morning, at first refused his offer of assistance. He had enough men, already too many in fact. The country traveled through would be hard, and it would be difficult to find water for so many men and horses. "But none of you fellers have ever seen 'em," vociferated Marcus, quivering with excitement and wrath. "I know 'em well. I could pick 'em out in a million. I can identify 'em, and you fellers can't. And I knew, good God! I knew that girl, his wife in Frisco. She's a cousin of mine, she is. She was, I thought once of this thing's a personal matter of mine, and that money he got away with, that 5,000, belongs to me by rights. Oh, never mind, I'm going along. Do you hear?" he shouted, his fists raised. "I'm going along, I tell you. There ain't a man of you big enough to stop me. Let's see you try and stop me going. Let's see you once, any two of you." He filled the barroom with his clamor. "Lord love you, come along then," said the sheriff. The posse rode out of Keeler that same night. The keeper of the general merchandise store, from whom Marcus had borrowed a second pony, had informed them that Cribbins and his partner, whose description tallied exactly with that given in the notice of reward, had outfitted at his place with a view to prospecting in the Panamint Hills. The posse trailed them at once to their first camp at the head of the valley. It was an easy matter. It was only necessary to inquire of the cowboys and range riders of the valley if they had seen and noted the passage of two men, one of whom carried a bird cage. Beyond this first camp, the trail was lost, and a week was wasted in a bootless search around the mine at Gold Gulch, whither it seemed probable the partners had gone. Then a traveling peddler, who included Gold Gulch in his route, brought in the news of a wonderful strike of gold-bearing quartz some 10 miles to the south on the western slope of the range. 2 men from Keeler had made a strike, the peddler had said, and added the curious detail that one of the men had a canary bird in a cage with him. The posse made Cribbins's camp 3 days after the unaccountable disappearance of his partner. Their man was gone, but the narrow hoof prints of the mule, mixed with those of huge hobnailed boots, could be plainly followed in the sand. Here they picked up the trail and held to it steadily till the point was reached where, instead of tending southward, it swerved abruptly to the east. The men could hardly believe their eyes. "It ain't reason," exclaimed the sheriff. "What in thunder is he up to? This beats me." Cutting out into Death Valley at this time of year. "He's heading for Gold Mountain over in the Armagosa, sure." The men decided that this conjecture was true. It was the only inhabited locality in that direction. A discussion began as to the further movements of the Toomey posse. "I don't figure on going into that alkali sink with no 8 men and horses," declared the sheriff. "One man can't carry enough water to take him and his mount across, let alone 8. No, sir. 4 couldn't do it. No, sir. 4 couldn't do it. No, 3 couldn't. We've got to make a circuit round the valley and come up on the other side and head 'em off at Gold Mountain. That's what we got to do, and ride like hell to do it, too." But Marcus protested with all the strength of his lungs against abandoning the trail now that they had found it. He argued that they were but a day and a half behind their man now. There was no possibility of their missing the trail as distinct in the white alkali as in snow. They could make a dash into the valley, secure their man, and return long before their water failed them. He, for one, would not give up the pursuit now that they were so close. In the haste of the departure from Keeler, the sheriff had neglected to swear him in. He was under no orders. He would do as he pleased. "Go on then, you darn fool," answered the sheriff. "We'll cut on round the valley for all that. It's a gamble he'll be at Gold Mountain before you're halfway across. But if you catch him, here," he tossed Marcus a pair of handcuffs, "put 'em on him and bring him back to Keeler." 2 days after he had left the posse, and when he was already far out in the desert, Marcus's horse gave out. In the fury of his impatience, he had spurred mercilessly forward on the trail, and on the morning of the 3rd day found that his horse was unable to move. The joints of his legs seemed locked rigidly. He would go his own length, stumbling and interfering, then collapse helplessly upon the ground with a pitiful groan. He was used up. Marcus believed himself to be close upon Mcteague now, the ashes at his last. Camp had still been smoldering. Marcus took what supplies of food and water he could carry and hurried on. But Mcteague was farther ahead than he had guessed, and by evening of his third day upon the desert, Marcus, raging with thirst, had drunk his last mouthful of water and had flung away the empty canteen. "If he ain't got water with him," he said to himself as he pushed on, "if he ain't got water with him, by damn, I'll be in a bad way. I will, for a fact." At Marcus's shout, Mcteague looked up and around him. For that instant he saw no one. The white glare of alkali was still unbroken. Then his swiftly rolling eyes lighted upon a head and shoulder that protruded above the low crest of the break directly in front of him. A man was there, lying at full length upon the ground, covering him with a revolver. For a few seconds Mcteague looked at the man stupidly, bewildered, confused, as yet without definite thought. Then he noticed that the man was singularly like Marcus Schuyler. It was Marcus Schuyler. How in the world did Marcus Schuyler come to be in that desert? What did he mean by pointing a pistol at him that way? He'd best look out or the pistol would go off. Then his thoughts readjusted themselves with a swiftness born of a vivid sense of danger. Here was the enemy at last, the tracker he had felt upon his footsteps. Now at length he had come on and shown himself after all those days of skulking. Mcteague was glad of it. He'd show him now. They too would have it out right then and there. His rifle, he had thrown it away long since. He was helpless. Marcus had ordered him to put up his hands. If he did not, Marcus would kill him. He had the drop on him. Mcteague stared, scowling fiercely at the leveled pistol. He did not move. "Hands up," shouted Marcus a second time. "I'll give you 3 to do it in. 1, 2. Instinctively Mcteague put his hands above his head. Marcus rose and came towards him over the break. "Keep 'em up," he cried. "If you move 'em once, I'll kill you sure." He came up to Mcteague and searched him, going through his pockets, but Mcteague had no revolver, not even a hunting knife. "What did you do with that money, with that $5,000? "It's on the mule," answered Mcteague sullenly. Marcus grunted and cast a glance at the mule, who was standing some distance away, snorting nervously and from time to time flattening his long ears. "Is that it there on the horn of the saddle there in that canvas sack?" Marcus demanded. "Yes, that's it." A gleam of satisfaction came into Marcus's eyes, and under his breath he muttered, "Got it at last." He was singularly puzzled to know what next to do. He had got Mcteague. There he stood at length, with his big hands over his head, scowling at him sullenly. Marcus had caught his enemy, had run down the man for whom every officer in the state had been looking. What should he do with him now? He couldn't keep him standing there forever with his hands over his head. "Got any water?" he demanded. "There's a canteen of water on the mule." Marcus moved toward the mule and made as if to reach the bridle rein. The mule squealed, threw up his head, and galloped to a little distance, rolling his eyes and flattening his ears. Marcus swore wrathfully. "He acted that way once before," explained Mcteague, his hand still in the air. "He ate some local weed back in the hills before I started." For a moment Marcus hesitated. While he was catching the mule, Mcteague might get away. But where to, in heaven's name? A rat could not hide on the surface of that glistening alkali, and besides, all Mcteague's store of provisions and his priceless supply of water were on the mule. Marcus ran after the mule, revolver in hand, shouting and cursing. But the mule would not be caught. He acted as if possessed, squealing, lashing out and galloping in wide circles, his head high in the air. "Come on," shouted Marcus, furious, turning back to Mcteague. "Come on, help me catch him. We got to catch him. All the water we got is on the saddle." Mcteague came up. He's eaten some local weed, he repeated. He went kinda crazy once before. If he should take it into his head to bolt and keep on running, Marcus did not finish. A sudden great fear seemed to widen around and enclose the two men. Once their water gone, the end would not be long. "We can catch him all right," said the dentist. "I caught him once before." "Oh, I guess we can catch him," answered Marcus reassuringly. Already the sense of enmity between the two had weakened in the face of a common peril. Marcus let down the hammer of his revolver and slid it back into the holster. The mule was trotting on ahead, snorting and throwing up great clouds of alkali dust. At every step the canvas sack jingled, and Mcteague's bird cage, still wrapped in the flour bags, bumped against the saddle pads. By and by the mule stopped, blowing out his nostrils excitedly. "He's clean crazy," fumed Marcus, panting and swearing. "We ought to come up on him quiet," observed Mcteague. "I'll try and sneak up," said Marcus. "Two of us would scare him again." "You stay here." Marcus went forward a step at a time. He was almost within arm's length of the bridle, when the mule shied from him abruptly and galloped away. Marcus danced with rage, shaking his fists and swearing horribly. Some 100 yards away the mule paused and began blowing and snuffing in the alkali as though in search of feed. Then, for no reason, he shied again and started off on a jog trot toward the east. "We've got to follow him," exclaimed Marcus as Mcteague came up. "There's no water within 70 miles of here." Then began an interminable pursuit. Mile after mile, under the terrible heat of the desert sun, the two men followed the mule, racked with a thirst that grew fiercer every hour. A dozen times they could almost touch the canteen of water, and as often the distraught animal shied away and fled before them. At length Marcus cried, "It's no use, we can't catch him, and we're killing ourselves with thirst. We got to take our chances." He drew his revolver from its holster, cocked it, and crept forward. "Steady now," said Mcteague. It wouldn't do to shoot through the canteen. Within 20 yards Marcus paused, made a rest of his left forearm, and fired. "You got him?" cried Mcteague. "No, he's up again. Shoot him again. He's going to bolt." Marcus ran on, firing as he ran. The mule, one foreleg trailing, scrambled along, squealing and snorting. Marcus fired his last shot. The mule pitched forward upon his head, then, rolling sideways, fell upon the canteen, bursting it open and spilling its entire contents into the sand. Marcus and Mcteague ran up, and Marcus snatched the battered canteen from under the reeking, bloody hide. There was no water left. Marcus flung the canteen from him and stood up, facing Mcteague. There was a pause. "We're dead men," said Marcus. Mcteague looked from him out over the desert. Chaotic desolation stretched from them on either hand, flaming and glaring with the afternoon heat. There was the brazen sky and the leagues upon leagues of alkali, leper white. There was nothing more. They were in the heart of Death Valley. "Not a drop of water," muttered Mcteague. "Not a drop of water." "We can drink the mule's blood," said Marcus. "It's been done before." But, he looked down at the quivering, gory body, "but I ain't thirsty enough for that yet." "Where's the nearest water?" "Well, it's about 100 miles or more back of us in the Panamint Hills," returned Marcus doggedly. "We'd be crazy long before we reached it. I tell you, we're done for. By damn, we're done for. We ain't ever going to get out of here." "Done for," murmured the other, looking about stupidly. "Done for, that's the word. Done for, that's the word. Done for. Yes, I guess we're done for." "What are we going to do now?" exclaimed Marcus sharply after a while. "Well, let's be moving along somewhere." "Where, I'd like to know? What's the good of moving on? What's the good of stopping here?" There was a silence. "Lord, it's hot," said the dentist finally, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Marcus ground his teeth. "Done for," he muttered. "Done for. I never was so thirsty." continued Mcteague. "I'm that dry I can hear my tongue rubbing against the roof of my mouth." "Well, we can't stop here," said Marcus finally. "We got to go somewhere. We'll try and get back, but it ain't no manner of use. Anything we want to take along with us from the mule? We can—" Suddenly he paused. In an instant, the eyes of the two doomed men had met as the same thought simultaneously rose in their minds. The canvas sack with its $5,000 was still tied to the horn of the saddle. Marcus had emptied his revolver at the mule, and though he still wore his cartridge belt, he was for the moment as unarmed as Mcteague. "I guess," began Mcteague, coming forward a step, "I guess, even if we are done, for I'll take some of my truck along." "Hold on," exclaimed Marcus with rising aggressiveness. "Let's talk about that. I ain't so sure about who that money belongs to." "Well, I am, you see," growled the dentist. The old enmity between the two men, their ancient hate, was flaming up again. "Don't try and load that gun either," cried Mcteague, fixing Marcus with his little eyes. "Then don't lay your finger on that sack," shouted the other. "You're my prisoner, do you understand? You'll do as I say." Marcus had drawn the handcuffs from his pocket and stood ready with his revolver held as a club. "You soldiered me out of that money once, and played me for a sucker, and it's my turn now. Don't you lay your finger on that sack." Marcus barred Mcteague's way, white with passion. Mcteague did not answer. His eyes drew to two fine, twinkling points, and his enormous hands knotted themselves into fists, hard as wooden mallets. He moved a step nearer to Marcus, then another. Suddenly the men grappled, and in another instant were rolling and struggling upon the hot white ground. Mcteague thrust Marcus backward until he tripped and fell over the body of the dead mule. The little birdcage broke from the saddle with the violence of their fall and rolled out upon the ground, the flour bag slipping from it. Mcteague tore the revolver from Marcus's grip and struck out with it blindly. Clouds of alkali dust, fine and pungent, enveloped the two fighting men, all but strangling them. Mcteague did not know how he killed his enemy, but all at once Marcus grew still beneath his blows. Then there was a sudden last return of energy. Mcteague's right wrist was caught. Something clicked upon it, then the struggling body fell limp and motionless with a long breath. As Mcteague rose to his feet, he felt a pull at his right wrist. Something held it fast. Looking down, he saw that Marcus in that last struggle had found strength to handcuff their wrists together. Marcus was dead now. Mcteague was locked to the body. All about him, vast, interminable, stretched the measureless leagues of Death Valley. Mcteague remained stupidly looking around him, now at the distant horizon, now at the ground, now at the half-dead canary chittering feebly in its little gilt prison. 7 hen chicks 4. The end. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey, the characters, and the world they carried with them. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Your support helps keep these stories alive and allows more timeless books to be shared with listeners around the world. Until next time, thank you for listening.